Have you seen any of those accounts where people who are on carnivore strictly or on very strict low carb, and they themselves notice that that they could be in a situation where they could be gaining weight? Have you come across any of that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it definitely kind of challenges the dogmatic view that I don't want to necessarily convey. I hope that people can appreciate that I'm saying weight gain or weight loss is both a function of hormones and calories. But I've definitely seen that. I would say those are the anomaly, where it does appear that most people who say go carnivore, which is the, kind of purest end of the spectrum version, it's very uncommon for someone to notice any kind of weight gain unless they started a carnivore diet and they were underweight due to, some starvation, or they're just coming off, a poorly formulated vegan diet. It's not uncommon in that case to gain weight simply because the body is filling back out. But yeah, it is not hard for me to imagine what might be happening there. And I don't want to make it sound too simple for my own sake, but in those instances, I would say this is a person who probably either had type 2 diabetes when they started and thus very high insulin levels, or were very insulin resistant and had high insulin. And then the high insulin simply is still generally promoting fat storage. And in this case, promoting it from the fat calories that they're eating. They're not going to have any fat being produced from glucose really in this case, because they're not eating any. But if you have high insulin and you eat fat, you will store fat, or you will slow fat burning, maybe you'll plateau before you want to and not get to the weight loss goal that you're hoping for.
And
so
high,
I would either say,
just to clarify, going back to your markers that you shared earlier, high for you, and again, you said that it's debated in different labs, would be, let's say, like 7 to 15, and definitely, of course, 15 and above. Is that what you're saying is higher?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. So we could maybe cut it off. I would almost want to refer to, work by George Cahill, who is really the godfather of fasting science. He noted that around 10 microunits per mil appeared to be the threshold where a body would shift over. Below that, it would go from fat breakdown, lipolysis. Above that, it would shift to inhibiting lipolysis. So relatively promoting perhaps a greater growth. Now, that wasn't a hard, fast number, but he proposed it on one of his figures, and he was such a legend in that regard that I can't help but, feel comfortable invoking him there. So let's maybe in this case, in this conversation, we go around 10 microunits per mil. But if someone's fasting insulin were higher than that, getting into the teens, I would say that's a person who might want to incorporate fasting a little more regularly. So as much as I acknowledge that calories matter, I don't think it is prudent to focus on calories as the metric. I think calorie counting is doomed to fail because we simply cannot account for every calorie coming in, and you cannot account for every calorie going out. And so I don't want to get ahead of myself, Drew, but my view on, maybe I'll answer the question this way, and that might answer that question more explicitly. My view on weight loss is that you have 2 steps you can take to lose weight. One is a step to deliberately lower insulin, and the other is a step to deliberately lower energy coming in, or to lower calories. Too often, we take the first step with the low calorie step. And people just start cutting fat because that's the most calorie dense food, and they keep their carbohydrates as the main part of their diet. If a person is starting this weight loss journey and they're already insulin resistant or diabetic and they have high insulin, if the first step is low calorie, David Ludwig and other labs have shown this too, that if you just lower calories but insulin is staying high, the total amount of energy available, or the calorie-rich molecules in the blood, drops. So total energy availability goes down, and that stimulates greater hunger. So if you try to lose weight where you're cutting calories, but you're not addressing the high insulin, insulin wants to tell the body to store energy. So it's always pushing energy from the blood into cells. Well, the brain is uniquely suffering in that case because the brain doesn't have a lot of energy storage capacity. Unlike the liver, which can store a few thousand calories as energy or glucose. Unlike the fat cells, which can store hundreds of thousands of calories. Or even muscle, which can store some thousands of calories in total. They have a little bit of reserve so that if the energy in the blood goes down, they can rely on their own energy for a time. Because they have it in them. The brain doesn't really have that capacity. It has a very, very modest amount of glycogen, but it needs to so combined with the fact that the brain has essentially no energy storage in itself, and the fact that the brain has a very, very high metabolic rate, it makes the brain very, very sensitive to analyzing. It's kind of the energy thermostat, the calorostat in the body, where if energy starts to go down, the brain panics. It senses that and will say, hey, I'm gonna start running out of energy. I have two pathways ahead of me. I either shut down because the energy isn't sufficient to maintain my current level of activity. In other words, lose consciousness, or I'm going to make us eat more, which is to say it increases hunger. And so if someone starts their weight loss journey without addressing the insulin, keeping insulin high, but cutting calories, then my worry is that is doomed to failure because hunger will win. I mean, to say this another way, if, Drew, you and I were hosting this beautiful buffet and we've invited the world's best chefs to come prepare the most delicious foods. It is an all you can eat. We want to invite our friends and family to come enjoy this with us. We would tell them, friends and family, we're hosting this buffet. It is going to be the most delicious food you've ever had. Come hungry because you're going to want to try everything. What would be the two things our friends and family would do to come as hungry as possible? They would eat a little less in the days before the event, and they would probably exercise a little harder. Those are the two very pieces of advice that modern weight loss science is built on. Eat less, exercise more. And yes, it will put you into a caloric deficit. It will shrink your fat cells, but it will be a temporary win because the more you're cutting energy in the midst of keeping insulin elevated without addressing insulin, you will go hungry. And sure enough, in this case, it worked. They come to the buffet as hungry as possible. But the problem is, if our weight loss strategy is built on those same ideas, hunger always wins. So before the first step of cutting calories is ever taken, let the first step be cutting insulin. So this is the idea of, my kind of three pillars of control carbohydrates, focus on the least starchy, sugary carbohydrates in your diet. So eat more fruits and vegetables, whole fruits and vegetables. Prioritize protein and don't fear fat because fat is not going to have any effect on your insulin. And if you can follow those rules, insulin will come down and metabolic rate will go up because when insulin comes down, metabolic rate goes up and fat burning will go up. And so now you have all of these other energy-rich sources in the blood. Now you have free fatty acids, which can be burned because insulin is low. And you have ketones, which will fuel the brain because the moment ketones start coming into the blood, the brain will immediately start using them. And so we always say that glucose is the brain's preferred fuel. I reject that idea completely because if you match glucose and ketones in the blood at the same level, the brain is relying more on the ketones than it is the glucose. So if it has a preference for either of those, it's the ketones. But suffice to say, if insulin is down, the blood is flush with energy, the brain has an abundance of energy, and it doesn't sense the panic if calorie coming in isn't what we expected it to be, because now the body is relying on its own energy for fuel. Because in the midst of low insulin, we can mobilize all of that energy. It's not locked up. And so with the first step being lower your insulin, and if you're hungry, eat. If you're not hungry, don't eat, and you'll find that you're not as hungry because you're using your own energy for fuel. And that will typically, just that one step alone will get the person to a weight loss, to a significant weight loss, whether they get to where they want to get or not. Maybe they reach a plateau a little sooner. That will vary based on the person. But if they do get to a plateau and they find that they want to lose more, now we look at that other step and we say, okay, now it's time to start controlling the energy that's coming in. But rather than counting calories, which is a kind of miserable way to live, now it's just time for structured fasting. The fasting combined with this lower insulin step already will allow you to start naturally controlling the energy coming in because you're structuring your meal plans in such a way to just limit the total amount that's coming in. But again, it's not taken, that step isn't taken with the explicit goal of reducing calories by some certain amount. It's still this idea of let the calories work themselves out. Now it's just time to start fasting. So that was my fourth rule. I already mentioned the three based on macronutrients. Control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat, and frequently fast. That that fourth step is taken once the three other steps or three pillars have already been in place, allowing the body to lower its insulin, and with lower insulin start using its own energy for fuel, which you cannot do if insulin's elevated. And now it's not as much a panic or hunger if you skip some meals sometimes. The brain is adequately nourished because it's relying on the fat burning and the ketones that come from that you're able to use in the midst of low insulin.
You hinted towards it too and said it explicitly earlier that, you see yourself as somebody who's in the middle, right? You're looking at both of these aspects that are there. And some of the guests that we've had on previously, I'd love to get your thoughts and comments on this. In particular, for people who are not severely obese, people who just feel like they have 10, 20 extra pounds that have been hanging on, or every year they're noticing they're adding, and they're 2 pounds heavier than last year, 4 pounds heavier than last year. They're slowly sort of adding these pounds over a period of time. So let's say they're somewhere between 10 and 20 pounds overweight, which obviously there's a whole bunch of caveats in there. And then let's say that the goal is they want to improve their body composition in particular, right? Some of the advice that was given before on here is that the reason that people, I don't love the word should temporarily audit their calories. Nobody's arguing for long-term calorie tracking, which is very difficult and kind of is very invasive in people's lives, and it's quite challenging to do, is that a lot of people that are even eating healthy in the wellness space, it's so many processed healthy foods that are out today. They're not ultra processed, but they're processed and they taste so good. We all have gravitated towards not having as much straight up whole foods that we cook at home. And we're having a lot more of these snack foods that are out there, right? The keto snacks, the bar that's there, that, and it's just so easy and pervasive to overeat. So a lot of times people don't even know the baseline of some of their favorite things or snacks they're eating in terms of a total caloric delivery that they are. So what are your thoughts on that? That at least for some people who, we're not nobody's coming from an total energy balance perspective, but that a lot of people actually don't have any idea. And even though calories are not perfect, similar to protein, so many people talking about we're kind of under eating on protein, which is impacting skeletal muscle mass. Of course, there's the strength training piece too, that people are not as active as much. You've chatted about this. They're living more of a sedentary lifestyle. And even if that's not perfect, still tracking your protein helps you at least get to a level, as long as it's coming from whole food sources and it's not combined with a bunch of other, carbohydrates and fats at the same time, where you're not just independently looking at protein, that it gives you some proxy that you're heading in the right direction. So what are your thoughts about that, of just even temporarily auditing your calories so you have some sense of what you're consuming? Yeah, Drew. And you can completely disagree, right? This is why we have you on. Right. This is why we want you on. Yeah.
Well, as much as I always do like to find a common ground. I really do. My baseline personality is to try to find something to agree with on people. I just have a hard time ever wanting a strategy to be calorie focused. So in this case, you're bringing up a lot of very good points. My view would be, rather than tell the person, hey, just really be mindful of the calories that are coming in, because I just think that is a tedious way of eating that leads to problems in the end, or just a hatred of eating.
Can I add one more thing before you continue there? And this is also, generally speaking, like, nobody that has been on this part of the series, they're like you, there are many people that are in the middle. So they're not saying like only calories, right? So it's like whole foods, staying away from ultra processed foods, and generally not being afraid of any macronutrient. Don't be afraid of carbs. Don't be afraid of fats, right? And just have a general sense. And if you especially focus on protein and making sure you hit those protein goals from a satiety perspective, it's just going to be hard to eat those other things. The challenge becomes when this is the argument that's been there, and part of a little bit of my lived experience, but I want you to comment. I want your perspective on it. I don't want you to agree with me. If you don't agree with me, is that when I audited my calories for a temporary period of time, I saw actually man, I'm getting so full on the fat that I'm eating. Not that I'm afraid of fat at all whatsoever. And my metabolic labs and markers, my A1C, my fasting insulin, all these things still really look good. And this is not the European trip. This is much after that process. And a high percentage of my calories, I'm sort of filling myself up on fat. I'm getting kind of full and I'm not eating enough protein in particular. And so I'm sort of missing out on maybe some of my ultimate outcomes that I'm looking at. So that's a little bit of the context that I was adding to it.
Yeah. In fact, let me maybe start with the protein aspect, and I'll kind of revisit the calories. I am an enormous advocate of protein and have been from the very, very early on. In fact, when I first got sort of introduced into the low carb community, outside of the scientific space as a publishing scientist, in the low carb community, I was very struck by people who were demonizing protein. In fact, I was so impressed in a negative way by these views that I gave a talk. One of my very first talks that people can still find on YouTube was me defending protein, referring to the insulin to glucagon ratio, and the differences of insulin response to protein in the context of a high carb diet, and the difference in response to protein in the context of a low carb diet. And it is very, very different. The degree to which protein elicits, or amino acids elicit an insulin response, depends heavily on the underlying glycemia, or the glucose that is coming with those amino acids in some instances. So I'm an enormous defender of protein and even advocate, which is why I prioritize protein as one of my central dogmas when it comes to nutrition. The beauty of protein is that it is, I would say, calorically inert. I think that one of the problems with the thermodynamic view of obesity and this obsession with calories is that we assign calories to a class of macronutrient that is not a fuel. Protein is not a fuel. I don't think on any label you look at, protein should be counted as having a caloric load, because it is all but it is a rare instance when you're relying on amino acids for energy. That is not common. It's not healthy. And again, thankfully, it's not common. So I think protein should be off the label. I mean, list it, sure, but don't give it a caloric value. That's not accurate. So because we don't use the energy for the protein for energy, we use it for a building block. Energy is glucose and fats. That's what we burn. Amino acids, even the rare instances when we are burning for energy, it is an incredibly modest amount, unless we get to true starvation. And that is the difference between fasting and starvation. The difference is, do you have fat to burn? Once you run out of fat and now you're in a caloric deficit, now you're burning muscle, relying on amino acids for energy, that is starvation. So not common. Now, having said all that with protein, I'm an enormous advocate, eat protein. One way to, but I also think we should eat protein the way, if you'll pardon me for saying, invoking deity, the way God intended. In nature, protein always comes with fat. There is no exception to this. No exception. But in our hubris, or our fear of fat, we have pulled the two apart. And now we have sources of just primarily protein. People will invoke chicken, but look 100 years ago, people didn't really eat chicken. We kept the chickens around for their eggs, which are this perfect balance of 1-to-1 protein to fat. You look in the U.S., what's happened to chicken consumption since 1909, it was essentially zero. And now it is the single most common source of meat we eat. And I'm not trying to vilify chicken meat. I'm not. But I do think it's worth sort of wondering how we used to eat once upon a time when we weren't so afraid of fat. But even still, chicken meat has fat. There is no such thing as protein in nature without fat. And that's why my third rule is don't fear fat. In other words, don't fear the fat that comes with the protein that you're attempting to prioritize. When we eat fat with protein, we digest the protein better. Most people just think of protein as having its own digestive pathway, and fat as having its own digestive pathway. Yet bile acids that are secreted when we eat fat only actually accelerate the proteolytic enzymes that are involved in protein digestion. We literally digest the protein better when the protein comes with fat. And this could be why people who just eat whey get a stomach ache, and yet when they drink whole milk, for example, they don't, or they even take that whey with some source of fat, like what I did, pardon the plug here, with my health code shake, making sure that the protein source had a fat source with it. You will digest it better. That's how it should come. Now, one last comment on this is that I am an enormous advocate of whole food. And knowing me by now, people know my affection for alliteration and, little helpful mnemonics. But if the food is coming in a bag or a box with a barcode, be careful with it. That's not to say it's going to be bad, but it is to say it's something that might be coming in a more concentrated form than you want. And so, Drew, as you were sort of self-experimenting and becoming a little more calorically minded, I think, a counter or an alternative process or strategy would have been, rather than looking at the calories, if it is even coming in something where you can count the calories, maybe control it a little more. Focus on the foods that aren't coming in bags and boxes with barcodes. And then the calories will work itself out. You don't need to count them. So it's almost like, that can be the simpler strategy rather than the tedium of counting calories. If much of what you're eating, well, not to mention just protein and fat together, that's always a nice balance. And certainly the natural way of eating. But if you're controlling the foods that come in bags and boxes with barcodes, that's typically going to be a pretty good strategy.
Well, even in that case, I've written about it, so I do want to just talk about it for a second. It was as simple as, again, I don't fear fat, but I was adding I would go a little bit ham, just slang for hard. I would go pretty hard on on my big fat salad that I still have on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Just even me kind of cutting down and getting to adding more lean muscle, which over the past year, and this is coming from, I think I've mentioned it to you before, I grew up vegetarian in sort of the standard sort of Indian and then also standard American diet, eating Taco Bell and this and that. Later on became vegan for a little while, discovered the world of functional medicine, started getting my labs done, was having a lot of brain fog, ate fish. I felt like my brain turned on for the first time after a few years, even though vegan worked great until it didn't. Right? I was feeling so great because I wasn't eating a lot of the process. I wasn't a processed vegan. I was eating I was for a little bit, but I wasn't long-term processed vegan. I was eating a lot of whole foods. And then it stopped working. And then I switched and I started eating fish and then incorporating other animal foods into my diet. And of course, the whole metabolic health aspect that's been coming in the last few years, which has even sort of narrowed it in with the emphasis on protein. So, as I went from 26% body fat down to 15% body fat, through a combination of strength training, which was about adding in the lean muscle mass, being even more increasing my sensitivity, right, to insulin. I would see things that would just be a little bit helpful for me, right? Even though I don't fear fat, I was going from a massive, generous pour of olive oil, and yes, that olive oil came from, it's just olive oil, but it has a barcode on it. To now, okay, great. I just put in, 2 teaspoons. Whereas before I probably was legitimately, I love olive oil so much. I probably was doing 8 to 10 teaspoons. And then not that I fear fat at all. I'm just talking about my own personal experience as somebody who was eating a lower carb diet, and just that alone. And I wasn't overweight. I was focusing on optimization and dialing into that 15% body composition just to even see if I could do it while adding lean muscle. And by actually cutting a little bit of the fat, it worked for me. I was able to kind of drop down, and I got from, let's say I was plateaued a little bit at 17%. And then I was able to drop down and get to 16% by making a few changes. Now, because I still was eating regular fats inside of my diet, and because I was eating a lot of protein and I was eating a lot of fiber, I didn't feel hungry on a regular basis, but there were some little tweaks that I made to adjust things to dial it in. So what I'm also partly I think what I'm hearing from you is that not that you would have any problem with that, and you don't have a problem with anything. People can do anything that they want to do, but that if that's advice that we're giving to everyone, which I'm not, I'm just talking about my own personal journey. And really the biggest issue is not people like me who are already skinny, who are trying to dial in their body composition and add in muscle. The biggest issue is in America, it's severely obese people who are getting really bad advice, which is to just focus on calories and exercise a ton. And that's not working. And that's where we really need to find something that doesn't require them to spend their whole day thinking about how they can start to not only drop weight, but improve their body composition, which is why calories is not the angle for you. We need to focus on these other core principles. Is it 4 rules or 5 rules? Mm-hmm. These 5 rules, you focus on those, and your premise is the rest will sort itself out for those individuals. Is that kind of the lay of the land that you're thinking about? Yeah,
no, I think that's a pretty good summary. My thought also is that when it comes to the third principle of don't fear fat, my advocacy of fats is primarily that, get your fats from animal and fruit sources being coconuts, avocados, olives, and being very careful with seed oils, or more and more these sort of new developed cooking oils like Zero Acre Farms. And I believe you just had Jeff, an episode with Jeff Knobs is going to come out soon.
Yeah, it'll probably be out before this episode here, so people will learn
there's
all
some
about
wonderful
that.
alternatives that are reaching kind of mainstream. But when it comes to the cooking oils, which are separate from a source of protein, I do think there's a reason to, be a little careful if you're going 8 tablespoons of olive oil or, Zero Acre Farms oil, maybe go to 4, depending on what the situation is. I do think there's a reason to be a little more careful on the pure sources of fat. As much as I am very friendly towards fat, I acknowledge energy does matter. And so it's no surprise to me that you found that was something you could leverage and experience some benefits. It is still, I do think part of our problem is we have a very fat phobic culture. And that has led us to not only develop seed oils en masse, kind of industrially produced, which are problematic, but also to focus on the lower calorie density fuel, which is carbohydrates, which I just believe we eat too much of. And of course, I would say we eat too much refined starches and coupled with too much of the unhealthy oils. In fact, those come together. If the food comes in a bag or a box with a barcode and it's starch based or, carbohydrate heavy, it's also going to have soybean oil or canola oil or some kind of seed oil in it as well. So it's a particularly wicked combination. So anyway, focusing on real foods, and being a little prudent with the sources of pure fat, I think that's a very good strategy.
I'd love to get your perspective on this. We recently had on Dr. E on the podcast. He's a gentleman that's primarily known for his work on satiety. He started the website Diet Doctor, and I believe he's based in Sweden. Yeah, he's based in Sweden. And a lot of his focus these days from his angle, and he is started off his journey. I think he read the book by Gary Taubes, which I believe is Good Calories,
Bad Calories. Bad Calories.
Yeah. That was really influential in his journey. And then he became a really hardcore low carb advocate. And still he follows a low carb diet. He talks about it. And his real question became, over a period of time, as his ideas changed, which a lot of people, their ideas, I wouldn't say change, but they become more nuanced based on who they're talking to and how to make a difference in public health. And as a medical doctor, he was thinking, if we, to paraphrase for him, my best attempt after interviewing him was, if we don't think about how to help people make better decisions within this context of packaged and processed foods, we're never going to make our way out of this obesity epidemic, because those individuals that are relying on those foods, it's a little bit wishful thinking that they're going to have the circumstances, the time, the education, the everything to say, okay, I'm primarily going to go focus on whole foods. And if somebody is able to figure that out, amazing. Please, we need 1,000 people working on that. His approach is, I'm going to start talking about foods that, even if they're processed, have the highest satiety score, which are protein as being one of the big ones as part of that. The next thing is fiber. He has sort of an algorithm that him and his team have created. And I believe the next thing was hedonic score. And there might be one other thing that's missing. Maybe which one it is. If not, I can pull it up. What are your thoughts on that aspect? It's really sort of twofold, that our society and our modern world, and increasingly the rest of the globe, is so addicted to processed foods that if we don't figure out how to help them, eat within that spectrum, it's such a small amount of people that are actually able to legitimately have the time to cook and get their foods from whole foods, which is, of course, nobody argues that that's how we've been eating for for a long time. And that's probably that's definitely how our ancestors were eating. It's just a very challenging thing to expect people to do that. So love your opinion on that. And then love your thoughts on the general approach of satiety as an indication of how to decide what to eat.
Yes, I'm very familiar with Andreas's work, and I have enormous respect for him and what he's contributed historically. And I even appreciate his attempts to sort of fine-tune what he perceives is perhaps an imperfect approach to weight loss. I really do. So I want to make sure that I really express that respect up front. I know him personally and have enormous respect for him and what they've created. Having said that, I don't agree with the central premise of their satiety per calorie model. I very much appreciate the focus on protein. That is one I share with them. But I'm a little disheartened to see that this is another way of just focusing on calories, as if calories are the unit of satiety, as if calories are what satiates hunger. Now, I don't want to speak for Andreas either, but I'll just note my main concern. Studies that really compare fiber find that as fiber, which has no calorie load, is incorporated into a diet, while it does fill the stomach, it does not promote long-term satiety. That people still get hungry. You can't trick the body's volume in the gastric system does not convey to satiety, at least certainly over time. So that's one concern, is that the unequal evidence in that regard with regards to how well fiber actually does promote satiety. But also the part that worries me the most is the idea of perfectly equating all calories from fuel. What I like is that they consider protein as not a fuel source. I agree with that completely, as I elaborated earlier. But they equate any calories that come from carbohydrate is the same as any calories that come from fat. And that is a premise I cannot endorse, I cannot agree with, because we have very well controlled clinical studies that have people eat isocaloric meals. So the exact same number of calories controlled for the same same amount of protein. It only varies in fats to carbohydrates. And we know from multiple different labs, different studies, that if the meal is one that is higher carbohydrate and lower fat, even if it's the exact same amount of calories as the low carb, higher fat, the higher carb, lower fat has what these scientists refer to as an earlier return to hunger. In other words, they get hungrier faster. And it's probably, as David Ludwig's group found, because the total energy available in the blood drops. Because if insulin goes up, which it does more in a higher carb, lower fat meal, even if calories are the same, if insulin goes up, it will stimulate the movement of calories from the blood into cells, and the brain will sense that relative reduction in available energy, and the brain will stimulate hunger. So regardless of the mechanism, and David Ludwig proposes a mechanism, namely reduced overall energy availability in the blood, which makes the brain get worried. And again, independent of that mechanism, we see that if the isocaloric meal spikes insulin because it has a higher carbohydrate to fat ratio, the people will get hungrier sooner. And so while I appreciate the model, and I really do, I don't mean that to sound pithy, I appreciate the satiety per calorie. I appreciate their attempts, even if I somewhat grimace a bit at seeing the way they're putting it together, like the hedonic factor, for example, which is sort of a little bit of witchcraft. There's really no metric of hedonism when it comes to food. What is hedonic to Ben is not the same thing as what's hedonic to Drew, for example. What works for me to really please my palate won't be the same as what works for Drew. So I take some issue with that factor, but even still, I appreciate the attempt, but I can't help but to groan a little bit inwardly when I see carbohydrate calories and fat calories get equated when it comes to satiety, simply because you've now eliminated the insulin effect of those calories. And the insulin effect matters, not only with overall metabolism, but even with satiety. In these studies, we see that if insulin goes up, satiety goes down, and the person will be hungrier sooner. So not all calories will have an equal satiating effect. That's my primary concern with this new paradigm that Andreas has embraced. So yeah, I'm a little disheartened, to be frank, because I just can't help but see it as actually a step back. That while we say that it's an evolution, in my mind, I see that it's just a return to the old kind of calorie-centric view of obesity. And I would be, happy for Andreas to disagree with what I'm saying, but the evidence that I'm citing, I'm very, very certain exists. And I don't know how that's been reconciled in that paradigm, in that calculator, if you will.
Well, I always appreciate, it's so healthy for people to disagree. That's actually how society actually progresses and moves forward. And we have to make sure that anybody that's involved in allowing these discussions or ideas to disseminate, we should encourage more of this, have people share their thoughts. And we should never be so fragile that our thoughts and ideas, and that's one thing that I do respect about Andreas after having met him, is I see him leaning into people saying, hey, great, like, this isn't perfect. Tell me your thoughts.
He's been very humble about it. He's been very humble about it. It's a testament to his character. He knows he's doing something new. And as the fiery darts have come in, he's handling it, I think, pretty maturely, frankly. And I don't envy him. Even if I disagree with the approach, I can appreciate the way he's doing it.
What is at night when you are a little bit more, more unstructured with your carbohydrate intake?
Yeah.
Are there a couple go-to things that you like to enjoy? And because you also monitor your blood sugar and your glucose, just as I do, using the Levels app and everything, are there things that you can do or that you do to lower the sort of impact and have you feel still better and not like you are coming off a hangover the next day?
Yeah. So so what I can't do, what I've learned is that I can't have cereal around. I'm honest to goodness, I'm addicted. If there is cereal in the house, I don't know where this comes from. It must be from college days, because I was a typical undergraduate and you eat cereal like every meal of the day. And you can get away with it. You're bulletproof. Nothing really upsets your stomach or upsets your sleep habits back then. But that is something I cannot do. Like, I will look at that and I will tell myself, I got a little bit of cereal because it's left over because we had, the kids got cereal today. And I will say, I'm just going to have one little bowl. It can't happen. And that's why I am so opposed to this idea of moderation in all things. I think that is an insidious, dangerous idea, because try telling that to an addict. I think it's just so ignorant to the reality of human behavior that if you would say, well, I don't want any wine. I can't have wine. Well, just have one little glass. Well, no, I have a hard time stopping. We'll just stop at one. I'll help. No, the person can't stop at one. That's like me with cereal. It's embarrassing to admit it. So what I can't do is indulge in cereal in the evening. If there is a true indulgence, normally I try not to eat anything, and it's just like I'm sipping on club soda, maybe with a little apple cider vinegar. And sometimes I'll also sip on pickle juice. I know that sounds bizarre, but we get these pickles that have like full dill and garlic cloves in them, and it's just really satisfying, and it just kind of takes the edge off my appetite. But if I'm indulging, we will occasionally have, in fact, very often in the home, we have true sourdough bread, like from an actual sourdough starter. I'll cut 2 slices of that. I'll toast it and put on garlic butter and then a little slab of cheese on the top. And just the kind of crunchy from the toast, a little bit of tart from the sourdough, because everything that's fermented is a little tart because of what the bacteria are doing. And I'm a huge advocate of fermented foods. I think that's one thing our modern technology and conveniences have deprived us of, because we don't have to ferment things for storage anymore. So anyway, that's an indulgence, where, and frankly, it does in fact have minimal impact on my blood glucose, which is why I sometimes will indulge. But even then, Drew, I'll have 2 pieces and I'll start thinking, maybe just 2 more, maybe 4 more. So I do in the evenings. I just am much weaker. And then I tend to kind of have to embrace the ideology of St. Augustine, kind of a rich kind of the Catholic faith, which I'm not a part of, but this idea, and he said, and I think it's genius, I would say inspired, abstinence is easier than perfect moderation. I think that is such an insightful comment, right? Because I may tell myself, I'm just going to have one little bowl of cereal, but it would be easier for me to just not eat a single bite than it will be for me to stop at one bowl. And that, to me, in fact, you were kind of alluding to this, and I believe so much of my view of life, even beyond diet, is controlling addictions. I don't want to become a slave to a habit. I don't like being a slave to addictions. And that's why in my own behavior, I try to moderate what I do. I don't like feeling addicted to things. And so I think with St. Augustine, abstinence is easier than perfect moderation, at least when it comes to me and snacking in the evening. Very, very often it's better if I just don't even start.
I appreciate the honesty because, when people are hearing the honesty on a podcast like this, it humanizes the journey that we're all on. I've never had that with food. I've never had a sense of addiction with food, except for when I was first went vegan. And again, this is my own story. I'm not trying to put that, approach or lifestyle down. I then later on, I got into this whole sort of trend that happened of like the raw food world. Are you familiar with that? Like people were eating like raw food diets. The beautiful part about that is I never ate as much fruits and vegetables as ever before. My skin looked amazing. Like there was a lot of great things, but I was under eating and I was already a scrawny kid, growing up vegetarian. And even though I was pretty active and lift weights and stuff, I just never could put on any muscle. And when I went in that sort of world, I was just under eating and just, out of ideology, thinking that this was the right approach or thing that I needed to do. And then I'd have these binge moments where I'd go and want to eat all the food that I could get. And that was my body's way of being like, we need more calories, inside of there. So outside of that, I've never really had that with food, with addiction, but I can relate to you because I've had that with video games. There was a period of time where I really had to actually take a step back and say, I think I have an addiction to video games. And it was in college, just like your cereal addiction probably started in college too. Yeah. Mine started in university. And then at that point in time, I just decided, you know what? Video games are great. It's an opportunity to connect, but I just don't want to play them because I know my tendencies and I know that I can want to beat this game and I get so into it. And I have so many other productive things in my life that I want to do. I want to spend time with my, wife. I want to build companies. I want to interview incredible experts like yourself. So it's just easier for me not to go down that pathway in the first place because I know my brain leans towards that addiction in that topic.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. 1,000 yeses here. Even me with video games, kind of having a lot of my childhood in the 80s, video games, that was really coming in. And now the home rule in my house is only because of dad and my fear of wasting my life away on a video game, that you can only play on the little Nintendo Switch if you're playing with other people. That's the rule. Yep, that's right. No solo playing. And so you're playing with others or they're there with you. Like if my little boy is playing a kind of solo player game, going through a dungeon or whatever, then I'm there with them and we're talking about it, where it has to be something social. Or if my girls are building a little home on a Nintendo game, then and I'm talking with them about it. Like, oh, you picked the bamboo flooring for that. That looks really nice. I want it to be social for many reasons, to foster familial bonds, certainly, but also just to try to let video games be a bonding moment and not lead into the addictive tendencies, because almost always if it's addictive, you're doing it on your own. You don't want other people doing it with you.
That's an interesting insight. Wow. Yeah. When you're binge eating or you're going on something and you feel this shame, so you actually also isolate yourself.
Yes.
Right? And food actually should really be a source of connection, of bringing people together. And really, I love that. That's actually a really great hack. I never thought of about it that way, but it makes complete sense. Is that if you have an addiction, it tends to be something that you want to do alone. And so really, you can still participate in some level, but it's got to be in community. And if it doesn't feel right to participate in community, then maybe that's a behavior that we might want to think about modifying in some sort of way.
Yeah, that's right. So Drew, basically what I'm telling you is once you have kids, it's time to get a little Nintendo. Time to embrace your video games again. That'll be all the justification.
I'm sure. Ben, as we wind down here and we have a little bit of time, any other topics that you feel very present to right now that you feel like we didn't get a chance to hit, or you want to just unpack a little bit more while we have about 5-10 minutes?
Yeah, you bet. So in fact, this was something I alluded to when I mentioned pregnancy earlier. So pregnancy is this unique metabolic state in the body where her metabolic rate is really high, and yet she's gaining a lot of weight by design. And so pregnancy is one of only 2 states where a body can experience something called physiological insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance, to briefly refresh the audience here, because I would have talked about this before, is a confluence of 2 problems in one. And you always have them together. I am unaware of any exception, and believe me, I've looked into this, so I'd know. And that is, one, that insulin isn't working the same way that it used to at some cells of the body. So some cells are compromised in responding to insulin, whereas other cells are responding perfectly fine. But then the second variable always comes with this, which is that blood insulin levels are elevated. High insulin or hyperinsulinemia. Those 2 problems come together. Anytime someone's invoking the term insulin resistance, you have to think that would be compromised insulin signaling and elevated insulin. And that's what happens with pregnancy. When a woman gets pregnant, from the moment she becomes pregnant through all weeks of gestation, she's becoming progressively more insulin resistant throughout the pregnancy. The baby is born and it immediately starts to correct. In fact, very, very quickly, even quicker if she breastfeeds.
And the body's doing it on purpose. The body's doing it on purpose.
Yep. Her insulin's going up. It's helping her store more fat. It's helping her mammary tissue develop. It's helping baby get fat and grow as well. So that high insulin and the altered insulin signaling is facilitating the growth. The same thing happens in puberty. That's why with physiological insulin resistance, it's the 2 Ps, pregnancy and puberty. Once again, in puberty, you have a little boy and a little girl. They start to develop rapidly, physically develop, unlike any other stage in their life so far. They rapidly grow and develop in numerous ways. Insulin is high. Insulin is altered in its signaling, and they have physiological insulin resistance. It is supposed to happen. Now, in pathological insulin resistance, which is what I study more explicitly as a scientist, that's when it's not serving a good purpose and it's leading to disease. It's a disease state. That's when it's making the body infertile. It's increasing blood pressure. It's compromising brain energy use, leading to Alzheimer's or even migraines and myriad other problems. So pathological insulin resistance is serving no good purpose, and it's only hurting the body. Unfortunately, some people have become enamored with the former, the physiological insulin resistance, and they're invoking it too readily. And I say this simply because I, to a degree, have my finger on the pulse of what is stated in pop culture with regards to insulin resistance. And people lately have started claiming that a low carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic diet, the more far version of that, creates a state of physiological insulin resistance. And that is absolutely false. The body is exquisitely sensitive to insulin, that if you were to give this person an injection of insulin, it would lower their glucose remarkably quickly. It would inhibit ketogenesis remarkably well. That body is incredibly sensitive to insulin. But there is some truth in pointing the finger at an altered metabolic state with long-term adherence to a low carb or a ketogenic diet. And that is more a matter of how much insulin is on hand. So very briefly, we know that when you eat a refined starch, a glucose load, there's 2 phases to insulin. There's this first phase and a second phase, and they both work in concert to help bring the glucose that has spiked back down to normal. Because if glucose levels stay too high for too long, it's lethal. It can start to change the blood volume by forcing the kidneys to dump all the water, and blood volume goes too low, blood pressure goes low, and then the brain can't get enough blood, and that, of course, is lethal. So insulin comes and helps. That glucose has spiked, insulin wants to push it down. There's those 2 phases. The first phase is entirely a function of the insulin that the pancreas has already made, and it's been holding on to. So it's all this prepackaged insulin. It's all set up in the boxes, ready to ship out the moment the signal comes. And the signal comes, and the beta cells of the pancreas start pushing out all of the preformed packaged insulin from all the boxes, if you will, that it's already built up. And at the same time, it turns on all of the metabolic machinery, all the factory, to start making new insulin. And so this first phase is all the preformed insulin. The second phase is all the newly formed insulin, which the factory is now making fresh from scratch. If we know in humans that if you just even fast, take an average American adult and have them fast for 12 hours, and then have them go do an oral glucose tolerance test, they may fail the oral glucose tolerance test because they fasted for too long. That even as short as a 12-hour fast, the beta cells, which are holding on to all of this preformed insulin, start to break down the preformed insulin. It's almost like the beta cell is saying, you know what are we doing with all these boxes of insulin? Let's just start breaking it down. They start dumping the insulin and they start breaking down all the boxes, if you will. But to be more precise, the beta cells simply degrade the insulin and turn it back into its component amino acids. It's just because the beta cell is too efficient. It's thinking, we don't need all of this insulin. Little knowing that in a couple hours from now, it's going to be challenged with a massive glucose load. And thus, the person takes in glucose. What would have been a glucose curve that went up and down in 2 hours, nice and neat, ends up being a glucose curve that goes up a little higher and stays higher a little longer, altering the trajectory, making it a worse glucose response. Well, this is what happens not only if someone has fasted a little too long, so that's a warning to people. Anyone who's going to go in and get an oral glucose tolerance test, you actually want to make sure you eat carbs the night before. We're doing experiments to this effect even now in my lab. If you fasted for too long, you'll basically get a false positive, or you'll fail that glucose tolerance test, not because you're sick metabolically, just because you fasted too long and the beta cells didn't have enough preformed insulin. And so you prime the pump. And that's what happens basically. To make a long story short, when someone's been adhering to a ketogenic diet, they may eat a load of refined starches or sugars and see that it takes longer for them to clear those sugars. That will happen, but it's not because the body's become insulin resistant. It's just that they didn't have as much insulin made. If they do the same thing 6 hours later, they'll pass it with flying colors and it won't be a problem, because the beta cells have basically said, oh, wait, we're back to insulin mode. All right, let's fill the shelves and get all this preformed insulin back on hand to get ready for when we need it next. So that's the problem. And in a way, it might be a warning for people that are adhering to a ketogenic diet. Be careful of your cheat meals, because it is going to take you a lot longer to clear that glucose. And I think there is a metabolic detriment to doing it that way, and alter the way we look at how we're going to spike our glucose, and with what are we going to spike it? How refined are these starches or sugars going to be? And what are we going to do to our glucose? Maybe prime the pump a little bit. It's funny for me to say this, but if you're planning on indulging and you're going to go get some ice cream, maybe eat an apple or something a few hours earlier than that. Just something with a modest amount of starches, but that is going to require an insulin load. Prime those beta cells a little bit. And now when you actually indulge with that higher concentration of starches, you're able to clear it much more readily than you would, because there is value in bringing glucose down. That is one of the reasons why I'm such an advocate of continuous glucose monitors. It's that we can know how often we're above average, we're above normal. And having glucose come up and down nice and neatly, that's good. That's fine metabolically. We don't want it when it's spiking up and it's staying up for a long time and going back up or wiggling all around. That's more of a warning sign. So again,
yeah. And just to jump in, I mean, that's great. I mean, there's so many like little nuggets inside of there, and my brain is kind of still catching up and like teasing them apart and applying it to myself. But one thing that I can think of is that as I've been monitoring my blood sugar, let's say like there's a place, one of the big things that I did is when I started going down this pathway through your material and Dr. Hyman's material and a lot of other folks, I pretty much got off of all the gluten-free foods that were out there, because they were spiking me way more, like the gluten-free breads, the gluten-free pastas, which I would not really eat on a regular basis, but still were in my diet a little bit. And I started going out of my way, because I do have a little bit of an intolerance and sensitivity with gluten, started going out of my way. And there's a few places here in Los Angeles that import in wheat from what would be called native wheat. And you can find places online that do that as well too. And when we would make food, or we would pick up a pizza, for example, if my wife was feeling like, hey, it's Friday, let's do a little bit of pizza, we haven't done some in a long time, I might have, I tend to be working during the day. I have a big breakfast. I do well with a big breakfast in the morning, skipping lunch, personally kind of working through that period of time and then eating again dinner. Just I've just found for my day, my schedule, my thinking, that does really well for me. And so I would have a big breakfast in the morning. My glucose would be very balanced. That would be there. Then we would go from basically not having anything to then we would order pizza from this place here that imports their dough from Italy. It's a place called Pisana in Brentwood. And we would go and I'd be naturally ready for like a meal. And I would go and I would eat that, pizza. Again, this is like once a month, once every other month. And initially because it was wheat and it was native wheat. And also it's there with like, the cheese, the olive oil, other stuff.
Yep.
It's a slower rise compared to the gluten-free pizza. You go kind of like you rocket to the sky right away, right? Because it's so quickly absorbed. So it'd be initial sort of slow. And then all night when I'd wake up the next morning, I'd look at my glucose monitor. I'd be the up, I'd be the down, I'd be the, I'd be all in different directions. So is that kind of what you were saying? That, I had fasted for a period of time, and then I all of a sudden had this like kind of heavier carbohydrate intake and fill of my glucose. Is that an example?
Yeah. So I think it very much would be a part of delaying all that glucose absorption from the blood. But also when we eat glucose in a mixed macronutrient, which is like pizza is a perfect example, right? We're getting protein and fats from the meats or the dairy, certainly from the cheese. What you're doing is creating this competition of burning. And so while it will absolutely, when you mix your glucose with proteins and fats, it will blunt the peak. It'll bring down the peak, but it will prolong the elevation. And that's largely a matter of the fact that when you're eating all these mixed macros, you're competing. You got your fats that want to be burned. You get your amino acids that want to be metabolized to something else. And the glucose is just sort of trying to fight for space in kind of boarding the metabolic bus. And so you're trying to clear out all the fat you just ate as well, in addition to the glucose. And so, but you do have that moderating effect of altering insulin and altering the glucose peak because you've mixed your macros, which I think is generally a good thing, to be frank. But it does mean that you've kept it a little higher, a little longer. Which I don't know that it's bad, but when you're waking up in the morning, as you have like a burst of activity, you get up, you stretch. I mean, talk about a stress on the muscle. You stretch and immediately start pulling in glucose from that, and that can result in a little drop. But you also, depending on how well you slept, have elevated cortisol, which is going to want to push the glucose back up. So yeah, the morning ends up being a messy time because there are so many hormonal signals that start coming online in that later part of the night and early morning, all in an effort to start mobilizing energy well. But yeah, when you've challenged the body metabolically the night before with pizza, that would certainly happen. So Drew, it's so funny. Just yesterday, I went out to lunch with a couple of my brothers. They're in town, and that's not something I get to do very often. I'm very, very close with my family, and so we went to my brother wanted to go to this a sourdough pizza joint, and all the crust is made from sourdough. It's like a true fermented sourdough. And oh my gosh, I was so stuffed when we got out of there. I just enjoyed every single bite. But it was at lunch, and so I didn't mind feeling full. And sure enough, I went home and controlled my appetite. But boy, pizza is one of those foods that I can just eat myself sick on any day.
So talk about the protein leverage hypothesis, your thoughts on it, and how it sort of relates to your view of the world. And then your recommendations for people who are listening. Generally, we've heard on the podcast previously, 1 gram of protein for, every pound of lean, healthy, your ideal sort of lean body weight that you're, sort of targeting. So give me your thoughts on both of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the protein leverage hypothesis is this really compelling idea, which you elaborated well, and I'll just reiterate, which is that you're going to eat and eat and eat until you get to a certain amount of calorie, a certain amount of protein consumed. That once you reach the amount of protein your body is wanting, that's an unscientific way of explaining it. Once you reach that point, then your brain will say, okay, you're done, you're full. And there is a lot of rodent evidence to support that idea, and a very modest amount of human evidence to suggest that it may be the case. I am concerned that idea is being invoked a little too readily, that there's not enough human evidence to really support the approach. Even and I'm not an expert on this topic, but if I recall correctly, even the originators of the protein leverage hypothesis, these two scientists, and both of their surnames are a little complicated, so I can't remember them. They noted some of the drawbacks with this, and the original intention in their research, I think, was to actually look at longevity. I think. I might be mistaking some lines here, but they were quick to point out that there are flaws as that model is extrapolated to humans, where if, the satiety, as protein consumption goes up, you start to get problems with fertility. For example, I believe they noted that the animals, stopped reproducing, in one of the colonies that were on this diet. So I think that it's a more nuanced discussion than most people would like it to be. But I also think, as much as I'm an advocate of protein, prioritizing protein at the expense of any other energy source, and certainly implying, which the satiety per calorie, calculation does, implying that any calorie from carbohydrate and fat is equal, I think leads to a pattern of eating that is not, in the human's best interest, where, we are not rodents, of course. We eat differently. We also may have a higher demand for fat. Certainly the ancestral records support this, where, Mickey Bendori in Israel finds that, the early humans deliberately sought the fatty sources of meat. That, the idea of our ancestors focusing primarily on the lean meat, that was relatively very high protein and relatively very low fat is wrong, if not laughable. But I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I'm not even a protein hunger satiety scientist. So I want to make sure everyone knows that. But I have my concerns with that model, that I think, that the overall human evidence, does not necessarily support it. And so I'm thus quite cautious in advocating it.
So how does that show up regarding your recommendations? Because you still do prioritize protein. So what are your recommendations when you're thinking about that? And again, you have your area of expertise. You've been very clear about that, your PhD and what you've studied and what you haven't. But as you start to mesh these ideas together, and from your perspective, how do you recommend that people navigate the protein side?
Yeah, my recommendation is to really get protein. Like, of all the macronutrients you have, focus on that one. But again, don't forget the next step, which is don't fear fat. The human body does not digest pure protein very well. I've already mentioned that. We digest it better when it comes with fat. And in nature, no protein comes alone. It always comes with fat. There's no exception to this. And at least not that I'm aware, and I've tried to find it. And we should eat it that way. We should not fear the fat that comes with the protein. And when it comes to protein, I don't think we should fear even being liberal with the fat. If someone is getting most of their protein from chicken, I actually think it would be helpful to make sure that you've added some fat to that chicken. Whereas I wouldn't say that necessarily with beef or other sources of protein in nature. But when it comes to chicken, which is something it appears in the historical record we did not really eat much of, chicken meat. We ate the eggs from the chickens. I do think it might be prudent to actually add fat. And I don't say that very often. In very many instances, it's generally just enjoy the fat that comes with the protein.
So just to be clear, how do you feel about the recommendation of a gram of protein per what people are shooting for their lean or sort of ideal weight? So if somebody is 100, they their ideal weight is a 135-pound woman, or it's a 175-pound man that they should be looking at, which is a lot for a lot of people who don't come from the world of fitness or don't think about that. They sometimes have a hard time imagining it, but that really their target should be in that direction, a gram per ideal pound of body weight. I think even Peter Attia and a few other individuals have talked about this as being a recommendation. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah. Oh, very much. Yeah. I think it's perfect. Now, again, I'm not a protein expert, but I am expert at other people's research. And Dr. Stu Phillips, in Eastern Canada at McMaster University, he's the authority that I go to when it comes to ideal protein for maintaining lean mass or even promoting it. And that is right in his range. And so I think that's a great range, and it's one that I can agree with.
There's a study that you shared on your reels on Instagram. We have a link to your Instagram below. Please, everybody, follow Ben Bikman. He does these breakdowns. Ben, you do these incredible breakdowns of studies where you're always keeping the audience up to date on the latest that's out there, and you'll talk about some of your evidence from it. And you'll even show a little screenshot of the studies so people can look it up. Not that I have any ability to really break down or understand what a study is talking about, but there was one that you shared that's on this topic, and it was on the topic of I believe the title was Lower Skeletal Muscle Mass is Associated with Diabetes and Insulin Resistance, a Cross-Sectional Study. Does this study come to mind? Do you remember talking about it? Can you talk about some of the implications of this study as is related to people who haven't yet fully connected the dots when it comes to muscle and metabolic health?
Yeah. Muscle mass so this is where, especially Gabrielle is such an advocate of muscle, and I agree with her in this regard completely. Muscle is a metabolic powerhouse, not only because it represents the majority of our mass, of our tissue mass. Mostly the average person, even if they're chubby, is mostly made up of muscle. But when you combine that with the sheer amount of glucose that the muscle wants to consume at any moment, it starts to paint a pretty full picture. Where in the average individual who eats a starchy, sugary load, as you see the glucose curve come up and then it starts to come back down, most of the reason why it's coming down is because of the muscle taking it in. So to once again invoke a sort of term of physics, the muscle is an enormous sink. And I don't mean like a sink running water. I mean, it will pull in, there are things referred to as heat sinks. This is a molecule or a metal that will have the ability to absorb a lot of heat. The muscle is a glucose sink. It has the ability to absorb an enormous amount of glucose. Again, a result of not only how much mass we have in our body that's muscle, but also just the metabolic rate of the muscle itself. So 80% of the postprandial glucose removal from the blood is generally going into muscle. So if we can increase the amount of muscle we have and move the muscle we have, we can keep blood glucose levels steady much more consistently. And of course, as glucose is steady, so too can insulin be. There's no upward pressure on the insulin. But as we it becomes a vicious cycle when you look at muscle wasting or muscle mass loss and insulin resistance. So let's maybe start with the paradigm of someone who's just becoming sedentary. I have a colleague at the University of Utah, and I was published on one of his papers, where they documented that just about 7 to 10 days of bed rest results in this significant increase in insulin resistance. I mean, you can quantify this. So let's imagine the average person who starts to become kind of sedentary as they age. They're on vacation, they're not active, they come home and they just don't quite get back into the swing of things, and that becomes this kind of steady decline in their average activity. If you're not challenging your muscle, of course, you start to lose muscle mass. And as you lose muscle mass, you start to experience higher levels of glucose. It takes you longer to clear the glucose from your blood. The longer it takes to clear the glucose, the more your insulin has to be elevated. And the more insulin is elevated, the more the body starts to become resistant to insulin. That's something we've spoken about in our previous podcasts, me and you. So this starts to create more insulin resistance in the body. As the muscle starts to become more insulin resistant, insulin is less capable of defending muscle protein. Insulin wants the muscle to keep its protein. But as the muscle becomes insulin resistant, now we have this proteolysis, or this breakdown of muscle protein, which is why so commonly in people with type 2 diabetes, we see that their plasma amino acid levels are higher. It's because that's a consequence of the muscle becoming insulin resistant, and insulin can't protect the muscle protein. Now it's breaking down the muscle protein and releasing the amino acids into the bloodstream. And as the muscles become more insulin resistant and shrink more, it further amplifies the glucose intolerance and the insulin resistance, which in turn further amplifies the acceleration of the muscle wasting, which keeps us going on this vicious cycle. So one way to break that cycle, yes, start controlling the carbohydrates coming in to lower insulin. But if you can start challenging your muscle in any way, make the muscle hungrier again, increase the size of the glucose sink, you will just have a much easier time not only returning to baseline levels sooner, but also keeping your glucose at an ideal level for longer periods during the day, which allows insulin to be at a lower level and allows the muscle to become more insulin sensitive, which allows insulin to defend muscle protein better. And now you can start to break that cycle and start to turn it around and reinforce it. So bigger muscle resulting in better insulin sensitivity, enabling better muscle protein synthesis, enabling greater insulin sensitivity, and again, turning the cycle back on its face.
One thing, as we've been talking more about protein on this podcast, Dr. Donald Lehman was the one who really wanted our audience to understand that he feels in this perfect recipe of, yes, increased protein and also challenging the muscle, as you mentioned, right? Just even 9 days on bed rest, 9 days of being sedentary, significantly increased insulin resistance. He sees it as it's 75% challenging the muscle through strength training, right? Or some sort of similar, not something similar, strength training. And people can get to that through body weight activities. They could do that in the gym. They could do that with resistance training, with weights and bands. And then 25% is the protein. But if we just have the protein without having a non-sedentary lifestyle that focuses on strength training, we're not going to get that perfect recipe.
Yep.
The gentleman that you follow that's in the protein space, would you say that that's generally your understanding as well?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. In fact, Drew, it's not hard for the audience to see the parallel here. Earlier, what I referred to with regards to the growth of fat cells, where you have to have both an insulin stimulus and sufficient energy to fuel that growth, it's very much the same with muscles and size, where you have to have the exercise is the stimulus, but you need the actual building blocks in the form of the dietary protein to fuel that growth. So again, the parallel being in the fat cell, you need insulin to stimulate growth and the calories to fuel it. In the muscle, you need the exercise to stimulate the growth, and you need the protein to fuel that growth, to actually provide the structure, the building block that will become the bigger, better muscle. Yeah, I agree with that sentiment completely. That as much as people want to focus on protein, if you're doing so in order to increase your muscle mass, it won't work. You can eat all the dietary protein in the world, and in the absence of a challenging stimulus, namely strength training, the muscle won't grow.
I want to come back to one thing you mentioned about fat. You said evolutionarily, there's a strong argument, even though that's not your area of expertise, you're just synthesizing a lot of things you've read, come across conversations, which I appreciate. There's a strong argument that we weren't eating a lot of protein with the absence of not having like the fat there. Anytime we had protein, we had fat. And in particular, you were mentioning that we even prioritized fat. Now, is part of that, do you think, and again, I'm asking you to sort of just extrapolate based on your sort of speculate, part of that also was combined with the lifestyle and a life of, depending on who you read and kind of talk to, we generally know that food was not as plentiful, and we generally know that it took more effort and energy to get and come across food, especially if we're talking about pre-agriculture and how life looked on Earth prior to that time. So it was part of that, hey, we're going to eat, first of all, we're going to eat the whole animal because food is so hard to come by. We're not going to let anything go to waste. Even still, hunter-gatherer societies live that way today, modern-day hunter-gatherer societies. And then also, secondly, we're not worried about how much fat, protein, egg, whatever we're consuming, because also just even the struggle to get food in the first place is a massive win. Famine is at a super high risk, and that generally we knew that a next meal may be even up to a couple of days for especially the men, if they were especially making sure that food was available to the women and the kids inside of the village or the camp or whatever it be. What are your thoughts on that? Is that could be one of the reasons why we also heavily prioritize fat, is because we had these long bouts of fasting in between where we needed that long-term fuel to just keep us going? And does that same thought, when we extrapolate it and speculate based on our current environment, does that still sort of add up with how plentiful food is, and in particular sources of fats in our society that come along with, it's usually fats and carbohydrates together, right? People eating a donut, pizza, other stuff that they're sort of surrounded with and make up the sort of modern day American ultra processed diet.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Drew, I hate to disappoint, especially after you presented the question so elegantly. I don't know. And that's my answer. That I'm simply not enough of the evolutionary biologist to counter that. I think it's a pretty prudent paradigm, which is, again, to say yours another way, is the reason our ancestors focused on the fattier sources of energy just because their needs were so different than ours. That's totally rational and could be absolutely true. I like your point about fats and carbohydrates together. I believe there's only one source of fat and carbohydrate together in nature, and that is milk. And thus it becomes a perfect mix, a perfect cocktail to help baby mammal grow as quickly as possible, where you are giving carbohydrate to stimulate growth with insulin and you're giving fats to help fuel a lot of that growth. I think, other than dairy, there's no other instance. Every other source of fat just comes with protein, as we've alluded to. So yeah, I don't know, Drew. I don't know I can't answer that. It's entirely possible that guys like, Mickey Bendori, he may have his own response to that. These guys, the actual evolutionary biologists, or Stephen Cunnane, who presented this shore-based view of evolution, where humans really have to focus on fatty sources to promote brain growth. Or the biologists whose names I don't know at Harvard, who presented what's called the expensive tissue hypothesis, who posited that the reasons humans departed from other primates in the evolutionary branch or tree is because our ancestors began eating fattier sources of protein, namely other animals. As we became carnivorous, it allowed our intestines to shrink because the nutrient density was so high, and allowed our brains to grow because we didn't need to try to eat every 2 hours. You didn't need to forage. We had time to think. Anyway, all of those lines of evidence do suggest there is a prominence for fat, but I can't answer the question, is that why we focused on fat? Those other lines of evidence, like the shore-based theory or the expensive tissue hypothesis, would suggest that there's something more real to fat consumption, than just we need calories at the moment. Certainly the shore-based view. Stephen Cunnane's work, he's a brain guy and a brilliant one at that. His view is that the human brain only evolved to be what it was because of the fat that we were eating. His view may suggest a more fat favorable view even nowadays. Of course, he would defend the production of ketones as a brain fuel because the brain doesn't use fat for fuel. But anyway, yeah, Drew, that's a long non-answer for me.
That is a very respectful answer because there are things that we just don't know about, and we can all have different theories, but I respect, and you should look for somebody who says, I don't know, right? That's a sign of respect because they just don't want to get out of their wheelhouse that they're trained in. So I really appreciate that answer, and I respect that answer.
In fact, Drew, let me just take that one step further. I actually think a lot of what's wrong with the world today and a general or growing distrust in science is that you have people who are going outside their area of expertise. I mean, not that we can't be Renaissance men, or people and be kind of excellent at a lot of things, but I do feel, as I look at the growing trend of people distrusting science and experts, which I think is entirely justified, I think a lot of it is born from people not being humble enough, not that I'm trying to compliment myself on my humility, but people not wanting to admit when they don't know something and instead presenting a facade of expertise that they actually don't have, or that they should be discussing with a little more respect of the topic because maybe the very topic itself doesn't lend itself to perfect understanding.
Well said. And I'd add to that one sort of caveat, which is that expertise can show up in a lot of different ways. There are many individuals that were some of the earliest researchers that were sort of amateur researchers in a way who didn't have a background in virology or this, that were speaking up the most during the pandemic about some of the misguided approaches that were there. And yet their triangulation, and they did have background and expertise, but immediately people would place upon it, it's like, well, let me see your PhD in virology. Well, maybe that's not exactly the expertise that's needed to break down a particular category. So yes, expertise, and let's be more open to where that expertise is and people showing their homework to show a strong argument in favor of what they're trying to present. And I think you generally agree with that as well, too.
Yep. Oh, absolutely. Amen.
Ben, as we wind down over here, and we're about to recap again some of your rules and then how people can keep in touch with you. First of all, I just want to say, I can't believe we've not met in person, because I really look up to you, the way you break things down. I have so much respect for you. And I also look up to you as a family man, somebody who prioritizes family, who also prioritizes career. You're an entrepreneur. So there's just a lot of affinity that I have to you and how you've built your world. So I just want to note that gratitude. There's always that saying
I appreciate it.
People don't get the roses when they get a chance to. That's what the kids are saying. Roses meaning giving compliments. So I just want to give you a compliment on that side and some gratitude.
I appreciate it.
And if you wouldn't mind, just to take us out here, can you recap your approach when it comes to a different pathway down the food and the dietary side, and then maybe even put in a bonus aspect of something to combat the spiritual despair that a lot of people are feeling these days?
Yeah. So just to revisit my 4 pillars: control carbohydrates. So in order to kind of correct the physical malaise, control carbohydrates. So focus on fruits and vegetables, eat them, don't drink them, and be careful of any carbs that are coming from bags and boxes with barcodes. Prioritize protein, particularly animal source protein, because you're going to digest it and absorb it all very, very well. And then don't fear the fat that comes with those proteins. And depending on the protein, be even a little liberal with adding some fat. And then frequently fast. Once you've been able to incorporate those 3 rules and you're feeling good, you're learning to burn your own fat for fuel, now incorporate some structured fasts and learn that discipline that comes from telling your body, no, I'm in charge. The part of me that is not the meaty part, I'm in charge, and I'm telling you what to do, body. I'm controlling the ship. And then maybe to add to this, engage in some physical activity. And people always ask me, what is the best exercise? And my answer very sincerely is the one you will do. So if it is to a young, healthy guy who wants to go CrossFit, hey, you do CrossFit. If it is to the old 70-year-old grandma, it's just, hey, take some walks around the blocks around the block with your girlfriends. Whatever you're going to do. That'll be the best exercise. And then lastly, going from the physical to kind of the mental, spiritual, emotional, it is make connections with people. And that usually will be putting your phone down. And for me and my family, it is this daily reminder to be physically affectionate with my children. Easy for me to be physically affectionate with my wife. I adore her. I have total fidelity in my marriage. As much as she may sometimes roll her eyes, she is the singular focus of all of my manly passion. And I make sure she knows it. And I make sure my kids know it too. I want my kids to see me loving on my wife. I think it's very important, but I also want to hug and kiss them. It's harder. It's harder as my oldest daughter is 16 now, and she won't hold my hand anymore. Not that she's rude about it, but my 13-year-old daughter will still hold my hand. My 10-year-old son will still hold my hand, and I love every minute of it when we're walking. And so I make sure that I will give them some kind of physical affection, that I will hug them or I will kiss them on the head, or just some point of affection that they will get from me every day that I'm home, unless, if I'm traveling, that's an exception. But I want these people in my life to know that I care about them. And then for me, it is also being part of my community. And I'm a very religious person, very active religiously in my community. And if someone is religious, well, then that's built in. If you're not religious, I still think you need to find people with whom you share some kind of moral, code. That sounds too formal. Just people with whom you share values, and get together, no matter what it is, can physically connect with those people in some space to reinforce these values, to explore the values, and to promote these values to the next generation. Because that, I think, is part of what is making kids so depressed and anxious. Parents are not promoting the values that they might have benefited from when they were young. And you see this a lot, as parents might have grown up in a value-based home and they start to reject those values, but the parent still benefits because they had a foundation. And I worry about the children who aren't even being given that foundation. So all the four kind of base macronutrient rules, with fasting being the fourth. Be physically active, and then establish connections in a physical space with people with whom you share common values. And hopefully those common values are based on good foundational traditional morals.
There is tremendous debate in the realm of fat metabolism and obesity. And the debate is essentially waging on two fronts, which is that, or the war is on two fronts, that some people are advocates purely of a purely caloric paradigm, that human fat gain or fat loss is simply a matter of balancing the calories in versus calories out. There's this other side, which is saying, and maybe I'm kind of straw manning both, but the other side, in its purest sentiment, would say it's all about the hormone insulin. Calories are irrelevant. Now, the truth is, in my view, kind of in the middle. And I think most people on both sides would probably agree. Despite us being on one side, I do tend to be more on the hormone side, simply because it's ignored, it's overlooked. So people will just. I can say this with absolute authority because we literally are growing fat cells in my lab right now. We study fat cell metabolism from the very origins of the fat cell. You can have a fat cell bathed in calories. It can be swimming in a sea of fats and glucose, which are the substrates that a fat cell will use to grow its own fat. It will either pull the fat right in and turn it into a triglyceride, or it can pull in the glucose and turn that to a fat and then link it to a triglyceride. That can happen. As much as some people say it can't, that is not true. A fat cell can turn glucose into fat. The liver can as well, of course, and that liver does it very readily. Now, nevertheless, you can have a fat cell swimming in a sea of all these calories, and it will do nothing with them. It will do nothing. It will not know what to do with the energy. It needs to be told what to do. And insulin is the primary signal, and it will tell the cell what to do with energy, namely, take it in and store it as triglyceride or stored fat. That cannot happen. Now, otherwise, and this is why in a type 1 diabetic, and this was the origins of my interest in this topic, are entirely from the early 1900s, where these legends in physiology, Elliot Joslin and Francis Benedict, they found that in people with type 1 diabetes, and this was before the use of insulin, before the discovery of insulin a few years later, the metabolic rate in people with type 1 diabetes was much higher than it's supposed to be. So it was about 15 to 20% higher than you would expect based on the size of the person. And that's justifiable, basing metabolic rate on size, because that is what dictates metabolic rate. There's tremendous myth in the realm of metabolism in the lay culture, in the lay audience. And we think that I gained weight because my metabolism slowed down. That's not the way it works. If you're gaining weight, your metabolic rate is going up. Like, for example, when a woman gets pregnant and she's gaining so much weight, her metabolic rate is shockingly high, and yet she's still getting fat. That's because her insulin is high and because her progesterone is high, and the hormones are telling her body what to do with energy. Metabolic rate is almost irrelevant at that point. And nevertheless, if someone loses weight, their metabolic rate will go down. So our metabolic rate is typically coupled to our body weight. So in these type 1 diabetics, they look at the individual in the early 1900s and they found your metabolic rate is much higher than it's supposed to be. And then this was followed up decades later by groups that found that when you treated a type 1 diabetic with insulin, their metabolic rate went from much higher than it was supposed to be to perfectly matched with what you'd predict based on the body size. So putting insulin in the system slowed their metabolic rate back down to normal from this 20% excess. And that's not insignificant, back down to a normal level. So my lab had for a few years been focusing on these two aspects of what might have been happening in a type 1 diabetic without insulin. So we found that when fat cells, and in my work, we used mostly cells and rodents and then a little bit of human evidence. And then I'll come back to what we've just done with David Ludwig's group with more human, because he is so good with doing human research and we're better with more mechanistic stuff. So we found that when fat cells were exposed to insulin, even in animals, not just cells, it slowed the metabolic rate. And all humans have what's called brown adipose tissue. And I'm sure the audience has heard this before. I think you and I have talked about it before. But all humans have little pockets of this fat tissue that has a very high metabolic rate. It's unlike the rest of the fat, the white fat throughout our body. It's brown because it has so much mitochondria in it. And the mitochondria is the kind of the bonfire within the cell. And so when the brown fat was exposed to insulin, it slowed the metabolic rate significantly, and it made the brown fat act more like white fat cells, the very low metabolic rate. In contrast, when fat cells were exposed to ketones, not the visceral fat, not the fat around our organs internally, but the subcutaneous fat, the fat that we can pinch and jiggle under our skin, that started to have a much higher metabolic rate when it was exposed to ketones. And our study at the time only looked at people that were in and out of ketosis, but we were able to get them into the lab and we pulled a fat biopsy from their belly, their subcutaneous belly fat, and measured the metabolic rate. And the people that were in ketosis had a higher metabolic rate at their fat cells. So suggesting that they were acting a little bit more like brown fat cells. And that is where the project with David Ludwig came up. I was thrilled when he reached out, having seen some of the work we'd done, and he heard me give a talk at a meeting about this. They had access to fat tissues that had been taken before and after an intervention. So we could do a follow-up in the same person and then determine to what degree did the dietary intervention affect the metabolic rate within the fat cells themselves. And to put it more brief now, there were 3 dietary strategies in the diet, isocaloric over these, I think, 20 weeks, isocaloric. And this is unpublished, everyone, so everyone needs to know, but the preliminary data suggests that the diet that was highest in carbohydrates had no effect on altering metabolic rate in the fat cells. And the 2 diets that were the lower carbohydrate diets had a significant increase in the metabolic rate of those fat cells. So that's what we've submitted, and hopefully it'll get published really soon because it's just more compelling evidence that the number of calories, yes, it matters, but so too do hormones, like insulin, because hormones tell the body, and especially the fat cells, what to do with the energy that it has.
I love that. First of all, that's amazing. I can't wait to for that paper to come out. And I love that you talk about how it both matters, but when we ignore one specific key side, and obviously calories have gotten so much of the attention that it's almost like people become a calorie advocate. And there's a couple different types of calorie advocates that are there. There's the folks that are out there that are coming from government or processed food sort of companies are like, hey, look, it's all about calories in, calories out. People aren't moving enough. It's not our food. It's not our junk food and processed food. It's really just willpower and control. Then the other folks that are there often tend to be people that, and I'm saying this lovingly because I used to be, vegan myself and, heavily, I would identify as plant-based, even though the crazy thing is I eat very plant-based now, still with targeted amounts of meat protein that have been added in. So I never reduced the number of plants that I ate. I just added in the meat and I feel a little bit better. Again, that's just me. And so I was saying that there's a group of folks that are worried on that side that if it is insulin connected to the refined carbohydrates that people are getting in their diet, then it tends to be harder to stick to a diet and be satiated when it's primarily based around a lot of carbohydrates like breads and pastas and rice, which those foods, we don't want to demonize them. But if that's all we're eating, even if we're low calorie, we can still end up with poor metabolic health, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah. So in addition to just the potential for more nutritional deficiencies, the more we avoid animal products, David Ludwig's group, to cite another one of his papers that is already published just last year, they found that when they gave human subjects isocaloric diets that varied only in the fat to carbohydrate content, the protein was clamped, the calories were clamped. One group was high carb, low fat. The other was low carb, high fat, same protein. And this was largely a matter of the insulin spike that happened as a result of it, but they found that there was a much lower, I think what they termed it was energy availability or available energy in the blood after the high carbohydrate version of it. And that's because insulin will promote the storage of nutrients. So you eat this insulin spiking meal, and insulin is stimulating the uptake of all the nutrients out of the blood into the tissues. And in contrast, if it's lower carbohydrate, insulin stays low, well, then there's more energy available and it's floating around. And they found, and this could be why when someone has an insulin spiking meal, another human study that has confirmed this, they're much hungrier much sooner. It could be that when insulin spikes, it's lowering your glucose, it's lowering your ketones, it's lowering your free fatty acids in the blood. And now the brain, which has no storage capacity, the brain is thinking, because it needs energy in real time, it's thinking, hey, energy in the blood's gone down. And I don't care if the liver has all of its glycogen stored in fat. I don't care if the fat cell has its fuel. I don't care if the muscle cell has its glycogen storage. I don't have any food storage, any energy stored, rather. We need to eat more. And so it stimulates appetite much sooner. And so there's a much earlier return to hunger when someone has had an insulin spiking meal. And it could, I suspect very, very strongly, it's a result of what David Ludwig found. It's this phenomenon of a lower overall energy availability in the wake of an insulin spike.
What do you think are the practical implications for somebody who's listening here, and really the advice that they're getting from their doctor? A lot of people go into their doctor, their yearly physical, and the doctor says, hey, listen, things are not headed in the right direction, but you don't have diabetes yet, right? You're not, you're overweight, but you're not obese yet. So there's a lot of we're kind of waiting and monitoring, you're on this train ride and you're about to wreck into another train. It's like, you haven't wrecked yet, but you're on your way to wrecking, but there's nothing that we can tell you right now besides lower your calories and lose weight. What do you think would be the implications of people really embracing this paper and your findings down to the one-on-one patient appointments that people are having with their doctor? What would that doctor start telling those patients now in the wake of this new information?
Yeah. Oh, may that day come sooner than later, Drew. Frankly, can't come soon enough. So yeah, it would change the conversation, and from one that I think would just lead to nothing but discouragement to one with a little more hope. Because it's not like the average person hasn't heard that idea before. Eat less, exercise more. And so even well-intentioned clinician that leaves the patient with that advice is doing the patient such a disservice, because the person has heard this. We've been saying that kind of thing for 50 years, and we're fatter and sicker than we've ever been. So it's clearly not working. And my view of it is that hunger always wins. That weight loss and improving insulin sensitivity would very much go hand in hand. My view on it is it's a long journey that can start with one of two steps. Too often, people take the first step, and it's this low-calorie step, which is eat less, exercise more. And I'm not saying there's no value to portion control and learning how to respond to your appetite a little better and sense, satiety a little better. I think that's wonderful. But if the entire dietary paradigm is I need to lower my calories, I need to exercise more, well, that's what you see on those game shows like The Biggest Loser, those reality TV shows. And what people don't appreciate is that you never see the reunion tours. You never see them get back together like you do other kind of reality shows. They get back together 10 years later or even a year later because they've gained it all back. It's a catastrophic way to try to lose weight. So
the New York Times did a whole expose and followed up with a lot of those individuals who won from The Biggest Loser. And in almost every instance, except for I think two of the people they highlighted, they had all not only gained back the weight, but most of them were actually heavier than before.
Yep, that's right. Yep, it ends up being catastrophic, to put it mildly. So if the weight loss, improved metabolic health journey is starting with this kind of low calorie, eat less, exercise more paradigm, I believe it's doomed to fail because hunger always wins. So you need to have a paradigm that isn't starting with hunger. And in my view, it should be the first step being control insulin. Don't worry about hunger. If you're hungry, eat. If you're not hungry, don't eat, and kind of renew your sensitivity to your own satiety signals. But with that paradigm, I think it's a little encouraging, again, because it's not based on hunger, and it's not based on this view of depriving yourself of delicious, satisfying food, where it is just kind of like those three things I mentioned. Control your carbohydrates, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. And there's a little nuance within each of those, but the proof is in the pudding. In collaboration with a local clinic, 3 years ago, we took 11 women and these are middle-aged to older middle-aged women who had just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And I knew the clinician well enough that we kind of conducted this approved kind of pilot study. But basically the conversation went with these women. You have type 2 diabetes. You can leave the office with a prescription for a drug, or you can engage in this dietary protocol. All of these 11 women that are the case report followed the dietary protocol, but it was just that simple, Drew. It was literally as simple as I just outlined. Control your carbohydrates, And again, a little more nuance, prioritize protein, don't fear fat. And within 90 days, there was no clinical evidence of type 2 diabetes whatsoever. The A1C had dropped 3 points. The glucose was in a normal range. They'd lost about 20 pounds. And the retention was fantastic because it was not based on hunger. Now, however, I do believe calories matter. And so my view is now that's the second step. So the first step is control insulin. Let's see where you get by just controlling insulin. You're going to lose weight. You're going to become more insulin sensitive, all the benefits that come from that, which are myriad. Now, if a person has plateaued and they still sense that there is room for improvement, now we can start to focus on the energy aspect of it. But then I think it should just be a matter of structured fasting. That is where I think we really lean into fasting, where it's not viewed as a low calorie effort. It's not starvation. It's just structured fasts. But that's the second step. A person has learned, they've learned what it feels like to have an empty stomach. They've learned to appreciate that does not mean they're hungry, that they don't need energy, that they have plenty of fat stored as energy in their body. And they can kind of go through that phase. But that's where I think it's a fast. So the first step is low insulin by controlling those macronutrients. The second step is controlling energy by engaging in structured fasting.
You know, the beautiful thing about that is that there's a lot of reasons besides, well, a lot of people think it's hunger, but it's psychological addictions that we have, and they have nothing to do with hunger, but food is our protective layer. And it can mean a whole bunch of different things. Maybe when you were a kid and, you know, certain things, or tension in the home or family, or you feel more safe when you feel sort of like something's in your stomach. And so all another reason that when we fast from anything, when we take a break from social media, when we take a break from, you know, too much input, watching too much TV, whatever it is, stimulation, fasting from the news, which is a great idea for a lot of people.
Yes.
We actually can bring up the true feelings that we have around something and see that there are some people that overeat because that eating gives them a protective layer. But if you can sit with that and actually see what comes up for you and see, you know, are you lacking a sense of connection, or are you lacking a sense of faith in your life? Are you lacking community and tribe? Do you want to, you know, address this deeper root that's there that makes you feel like you're not whole, that you're covering up with food? But in my experience, I tend to see that it's harder to find that and get to the source of that addiction. I'm using that broadly here. Mm-hmm. It's harder to do that when we have a diet that's constantly putting us on that roller coaster of glucose throughout the day and firing off dopamine in a way inside of our body, that we're getting that hit of our blood sugar going up and then our blood sugar crashes afterwards. So it's a lot easier to address those things when you're approaching it from a more stable point of view. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, yes. You're touching on the kind of deeper aspect here, where I'm always very quick to tell people the concepts, and as I just described them in a couple minutes, are quite simple, but that doesn't mean they're easy. Because when it comes to changing diet, you were talking about deep-seated habits, and yes, dare we say addictions, where people have all kinds of addictions to all kinds of different things, including, I heard a talk of an expert talking about eating disorders. There is eating addictions where the person's addicted to feeling full. It's not that they're addicted to any one particular food. They're addicted to feeling full. And I thought that is such a unique form of eating addiction, where the person is just, they can't stand having an empty stomach. It's physically, emotionally, psychologically, it's very uncomfortable for them. And I think so as much as I say that these ideas are simple, and they are, control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat, they're simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy to incorporate, because you're talking about people changing their habits, and that is not something people do very, very readily.
You know, I think when we embrace these principles and we see it as sort of an adventure, and we're learning about what works for us, because within everything that you've shared, as you've talked about, there's nuances and there's personalization, right? Some people, I come from a tradition and faith background. I don't identify it by it now, but it's a spiritual tradition out of India that really strongly identifies with being vegetarian. That's kind of like one of their core aspects. It's the Jain tradition. There's a lot of beautiful things about that religion and that background. And I really respect anybody who's using is any faith-based group that's out there and is trying to make the world better. And largely, those people are more giving. They're more caring in the world. There's a lot of beautiful benefits that come from a lot of faith-based groups that are out there. Now, I'm not going to try to go and convince somebody out there to change their diet, which is actually harder than probably changing your religion, is changing your diet and doing these things, especially if you were vegan or vegetarian and now somebody's trying to tell you that they felt better eating meat and you should too. They're not going to do it, and that's not obviously in my interest to try to shift anybody's ideas. I do talk about my story and what I felt, my history with depression, my low omega-3 to omega-6 ratio was off, low amount of omega-3 fats that are in there. And that sometimes speaks to individuals that are there. But within that, you can still be vegetarian and still take advantage of all these principles that you're talking about and feel better. We have a mutual friend, Dr. Casey Means, who's largely plant-based. She does eat a little bit of fish. She's been on this podcast before. And I love what she posts, because even though she's eating a lot of foods that kind of give me a lot of irritation, like beans and other things like that, she's combining them and showing them and making them in ways that goes beyond the food wars, and shows that regardless of what your beliefs are, regardless of how you decide you want to eat, you can still take advantage of these principles and reap the rewards of following them.
Yep, I agree 100%. Yep, I think that it's so important for us to never talk about these topics in a way that's going to alienate individuals. And Casey's a perfect example. What a delightful person. Yeah, I never want these ideas to come across as polarizing. That these should be ideas that are foundational, upon which a myriad of homes can be built. As long as we have the common foundation, there's the strong, firm foundation. Well, then what goes on top of it can be different.
I want to dig into fasting. Do you think that it's important to start making changes in the diet first before they go down the rabbit hole of fasting, or can we jump into fasting right away?
Yeah, that's a good question. And my view on it is probably that diet needs to be somewhat aligned, or maybe I'll say it this way. I think a person just would need to have a plan. Nowadays, I worry that people jump onto, say, like an OMAD or 1 meal a day kind of bandwagon, and they will say, I'm going to eat 1 meal a day. So they fast for 22 hours, and then they're not used to it, and they get hungry, and then they just break at their meal, and they binge, and they eat garbage, and they overeat. And so I worry that nowadays a lot of people are looking at fasting, and it's turned into kind of a glorified version of a binge purge cycle. I know that's kind of crass to say, but they are going hungry all day, and then they are breaking their fast with garbage. They're eating junk food, processed carbohydrates, processed seed oils, and they eat themselves sick because they overeat. So my view on fasting is how you break a fast matters much more than how long the fast goes. And so I would rather personally see someone who says, I'm going to do a 16-hour fast, which is very modest. Most adults should be able to do that very easily. But then have a plan, and they know, all right, when I break my fast, I'm going to eat, these 2 hard-boiled eggs first with salt and water. And then I'm going to give myself an hour or so to, get over that and not, see how full I am later. And then anyway, but focus on foods that won't just spike your insulin up. That's what worries me, is that so much of the value of a fast is that your insulin levels have come down. And there's tremendous benefit to that. You're becoming more insulin sensitive. Your mTOR is turned down so you can break things down before you build them back up. It helps with the brain because the little bit of ketosis can fuel the brain in a way that glucose simply cannot. So we've lowered insulin. We've worked so hard during this fast to lower insulin, and then we immediately spike it up and turn everything off. Well, why would we want to do that? Let's help insulin stay low a little longer, and then focus, however you break your fast, focus on foods that won't spike insulin quite so much. So yeah, I don't know that there's a right or wrong way to fast, but I would say the wrong way to fast is when you're focused purely on the timeline and not on the plan for when the fasting ends.
What would seem to be, whether people know it or not, when you're going to sleep, right? You're taking a break from food and then you start breakfast the next day. And a lot of individuals who think that they're doing the right thing and are being healthy, they'll start off their morning with, let's say, some fruit or fruit juice. Yeah. Talk to us about why that might not be the best thing for your long-term health.
Yeah. So not all fruits would be included in this kind of scrutiny that I have for them. But unfortunately, most breakfast fruits happen to be those that are the most sugary, like the tropical fruits, pineapples or banana. People love bananas, right? Everyone's always adding bananas to a smoothie. And so those kinds of fruits happen to be the ones that spike insulin the most, and even glucose. It's surprising when people wear a CGM, like they have the Levels app, and you see what happens when you eat these sugary fruits. It's pretty significant. So, yeah, but especially I would say if someone's going to have fruit, at the very least eat it. Don't drink it. Don't make a juice smoothie or a smoothie or juice a fruit. I am vehemently opposed to fruit juice. I think it is a result of remarkably clever marketing, and with the best of intentions, parents will be giving their kids, and of course I'm sensitive to this because I have little kids. They'll be giving their kids fruit juice, thinking they're doing them a favor, but fruit juices often will have as much or more sugar than soda pop will. Now there may be some other beneficial molecules in there, so I'm not trying to say they're worse than soda, but just comparing it head to head with regards to the sugar content, it can have as much sugar in it as a soda pop will. So I'm not a fan of fruit. Drinking fruit. I'm more a fan of eating fruit, but those tropical fruits, I think we do need to be careful with, like bananas and mangoes, etc. But other fruits, some people could enjoy liberally. In fact, I'm kind of on that. I don't even like to say I'm a low carb advocate. I'm a control carb advocate. Just be smart about the carbohydrates. And when it comes to fruits and vegetables, if these are the kind of lower sugar fruits, then my view is enjoy them ad libitum. There's no need to count grams. Maybe if you're a type 2 diabetic trying to get off medications, you got to be a little more careful. But for the lot of us that are just trying to be metabolically healthy or correct some mild metabolic disruption, my view is fruits are to be enjoyed liberally, but scrutinize if you need to that it's not these tropical fruits.
So for yourself this morning for breakfast, did you have breakfast? Did you skip breakfast?
Yeah.
Let's talk about your routine, which again is your routine. We're not trying to extrapolate that for everybody else, but it's always nice for people to hear. Yeah,
right, sure. So I will say that, I'm 45. And when I started going bald in my early 20s, I told my wife right when we got married, kind of mid 20s, I said, sweetheart, I'm going to be bald, but I'm going to keep it real. That's a kind of filtered version, for the kids in the crowd here. I said, I'm going to look good. I'm doing what I can to control my health. And so I will say there's something somewhat effortless about it. My simple strategy is control carbohydrates, prioritize protein, don't fear fat. Really those three, if someone adheres to those, it makes, at least for me, it's been reasonably effortless to stay lean. Now, it's not that I just come from a family of purely lean people. No, we have the potential to get chubby like most people do. So for me, breakfast is really a matter of how hard did I work out the day before. And yesterday, kind of getting back into the swing of things from Thanksgiving, I had a very hard, good workout yesterday. And when I woke up this morning, I was really noticeably hungry. Normally, I won't eat. I'll just drink a cup of tea or something. But this morning, I made a shake. And so I won't. So I helped design a low-carb meal replacement shake, full disclosure. So I have a vested interest perhaps in saying this. But I wanted a shake that was very low carb, but high in protein and fat, matched 1-to-1 by mass. And so I made myself up a little shake. I added a little egg to it, one raw egg. I just love raw eggs and shakes. I know it sounds
makes
crazy.
Things like really frothy and
so creamy. It's so. In fact, Drew, a little aside, I would sometimes make my wife a shake in the morning because she'd ask for one, and she loved it every morning. She came in one time and saw me putting it in the blender and saw me cracking the egg, and she says, "Ben, what are you doing with that egg? I don't want an egg in my shake." And I say, "Sweetheart, I always put an egg in your shake." No, don't put that in there. I don't want that. She drinks the shake and she says, "All right, Ben, I just don't want to see you put the egg in the shake." So anyway, that's what breakfast was this morning. So my view on diet is I am very strict with myself for breakfast and lunch. I have very, very low carbohydrate, very high protein and fat, reasonably. And if I don't eat breakfast, then I make sure I eat a larger than normal lunch. I want my lunch to be the most filling, large meal of the day, at least for me and my addictive habits or my habits, maybe to put it more mildly. If I go home at the end of the day very hungry, it makes it very hard for me to control my appetite at dinner and even into the evening. that I am snacky all evening. Even though I am full, I am stuffed. I just am like creeping around the house trying to find something to snack on. But if I go home from work and I've had a big filling lunch, I'm still kind of full when I go home for dinner. Now, dinner is the social meal. That is the meal I want to spend time with my wife and my kids. And so I'm going to eat dinner. And usually I just eat dinner with the family. Now, my wife is generally, she sees things the way I do. So our dinners are generally pretty well planned, not a lot of refined starches, but I will eat dinner with the family. Whatever the family's having, that's what I'm eating. And if it's a lot of processed carbs that are going to spike my insulin, I know it's going to happen. I'll try to eat a little less of it, but I don't want my kids to be looking at dad in a kind of weird way and have that kind of form. I want them to know in our home we eat real food and real protein and real fat, but I don't want it to be weird, for them. And that's the social time. I want my priority to be visiting with my kids and my wife. So I'm very strict with breakfast. I'm very strict with lunch. And then I'm much looser with dinner. And then again, if I can come home reasonably full, I have a smaller dinner, but I'm social, I'm visiting. And it makes it really easy to not be snacking in the evening. I can just be sipping on some club soda, which is kind of my favorite thing to do, and I'm good.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think in our first couple interviews, a lot of the questions that I got sent in and on comments was, it's easy to, when somebody's such an advocate for knowledge around a particular subject, right? Insulin resistance, being mindful of how your glucose is spiking, being mindful about how many refined carbohydrates, we tend to project back upon that person that, wow, this person doesn't eat any. I mean, everybody eats some carbs, right? We think that this person is either perfectly, but also that their definition of doing it right is some weird, perfect thing, but it's not. And I think that what you're sharing here is, in addition to you sharing earlier that, like, I'm not a low carb, I'm a smart carb, mindful carb advocate, and getting those carbohydrates from vegetables primarily. And then there's times, especially in the context of a family, you're not just eating with you are raising kids, you have a partner as well. So you're trying to demonstrate that, like, we can still be healthy without being so attached to one particular way of viewing the world. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And also too, you've probably seen monitoring your own glucose, and I don't know how often you check your your insulin levels, but you've also probably seen that you still get the results that you want to get.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. I've definitely found that for my metabolic tendencies, and I don't have a family history of type 2 diabetes, and so that does allow me a little bit more wiggle room than someone who, say, has struggled with type 2 diabetes in the past. That is absolutely someone who has to be more careful. But yes, I've found that what I'm doing is working well. And I'll also add very, very quickly, Drew, you didn't ask this, but I wonder, I get so many questions about this that I wonder if someone would be wondering, what do I feed my kids? Like, if I'm just sipping on a cup of tea, or I'm having a shake in the morning, because I just like breakfast to be simple, I don't like putting a lot of effort into it. I do make breakfast for the kids every morning. It's a very exceptional day when they just have cereal. We just don't keep cereal in the house. It's very infrequent. And so that's something that's important to me. When I grew up, my dad would make breakfast. We lost my mom when we were all quite young. My dad was kind of he did it all. And he would make big hearty bowls of oatmeal, like from scratch every morning, none of this kind of quick oats. And I appreciated seeing my dad do that. And breakfast became a very important time in my family. It was a very important time of day because, I'm one of 9 kids. All the rest of the day was just chaos. But breakfast was kind of the one quiet time where dad could be in charge. And it was kind of we would read scriptures, have a family prayer and have a breakfast together. And so for me, in the culture of my family, I'm in charge of breakfast, and I make almost every morning. It's a rotation of waffles and crepes. Now that's surprising, I'm sure, to some people, but I just make sure my priority is every single crepe the kids are eating has 1 egg in it. Like the way I've kind of quantified it all. And so even though it has a little bit of whole milk, which I'm good with the kids drinking, but it also has maybe I don't know how much flour it would have, but I use flour. It's almost impossible to make good crepes without just wheat flour, just because you need that gluten. And none of my kids have a gluten sensitivity. So I will make crepes so that every single crepe has 1 full egg in it, or I'll make waffles where every single waffle has 2 or 3 eggs in it. They're very hearty. And my view is I'm looking at the kid, and sometimes it'll be bacon and eggs. Sometimes I'll make little kind of egg muffins with bacon and cheese. And those, of course, are obviously good. But even I would want anyone to know, even even for me, as much as I know, I don't mind if my kids are having a big hearty eggy crepe or a big hearty eggy waffle, lots of butter, a little bit of maple syrup on it. I want my kids to just be accustomed to eating real food, not just from bags and boxes with barcodes, and that they're getting good fats and good proteins. And I think eggs are just kind of the perfectly packaged little product. And so breakfast for me is my priority for the kids is how many eggs can I shove in their adorable little mouths.
It's great. I mean, people are always wondering about kids, and human beings have this biological shortcut tendencies as we tend to go for concentrated calories, right? And when kids have a taste of something, they're going to want it. But as long as you can make those things from home, is really what I'm hearing you say, then we're not getting all the additives that have been added to it, all the extra sugar, right? It's the maple syrup that you're adding to it. It's not the packed sugar that happens at the factory before it even comes to you. And that's one way of just doing the best that we can and making sure that also too, kids are growing so they can handle a lot of calories and they can handle a lot of foods that maybe as we get older, those foods would have a lot more of an impact on us. The same way that I think that a lot of the fasting conversation has evolved for saying, okay, here's the general fasting advice, but also too, if you're a woman who is in your prime fertile years, you may not benefit from doing these long fasting, and maybe one meal a day could end up stressing you out biologically, even if you're not trying to have a baby right now. So maybe eating, just sticking to time restricted eating of 12 to 16 hours is going to be better than trying to do one meal a day, which could cause a lot of other challenges and stress on your body. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would just say well said. Yeah, back to the kids just specifically, my thought is when a mammal is growing, it makes sense for the mammal to have all three macronutrients, carbs, protein, fat. And that is why I think mammalian milk is in fact high in all three macros, because this is mama mammal trying to grow baby mammal well and in a healthy way and rapidly. And so humans, of course, we grow more slowly than most other animals do, most mammals do. But even still, when my kids, if they're eating more carbs than I am, I don't mind, especially if it's coming with lots of fats and lots of protein from real natural sources, because it's going to be much more satiating and they're not going to be snacking. It's kids that are snacking on crackers and chips where it's just pure carb, basically, or very protein devoid at the very least. That's the problem. My kids, they eat one big hearty buttery waffle with a little bit of syrup. They're done after one waffle because it's so filling.
Yeah. And especially on that note, just the same advice that you gave to adults, as long as our kids are not drinking their calories as a primary source throughout the day, then that's another big aspect. We were chatting a little bit beforehand, but we just did a couple episodes on how fructose really activates that uric acid component. And one of the biggest components of that is going to be, fruit juice, and drinking it, as you mentioned earlier, is completely different than eating a whole fruit, which is going to do well for most, people.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. In fact, not that I'm an expert on this topic, but the reason I love what you just said, pointing out fruit, and when the body metabolizes fructose, uric acid is an unavoidable byproduct. And it's frustrating for me how many people, and I don't mean to be a great advocate of meat eating. I really don't. Even someone the other day said, well, you're just such an advocate of the ketogenic diet so that you can't see anything else. And I really resented that, although I wasn't offended. But I thought to myself, I don't want to be an advocate, but I will be a defender. And so I'm a defender of meat. But as much as people vilify meat for the purines, for example, and they'll say, well, meat's going to cause gout because of the uric acid. The amount of uric acid you're getting from eating meat is so insignificant compared to what you get from, say, metabolizing fructose, especially with how much fructose people are eating these days. So I think it's important to note people that are struggling with uric acid and gout in particular, and a lot of people are, well, all the more reason to control the fruit juice and don't be so afraid of the meat, perhaps.
If I asked you to create the perfect recipe for society to make them sick, fat, hungry all the time, miserable, and ultimately die a painful death, how would you do that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the easy answer is just to be doing what everyone's doing. But to say that another way, it would be to start life, to become insulin resistant as early as possible in life. You know, becoming insulin resistant as a child, which happens more and more around the world, truly around the world. China, India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, North America. We always think in North America that we're the worst, that we're the fattest, sickest, and we're not. In fact, we're not even in the top 20 when it comes to these problems that we're speaking about. But it's a global problem. So become insulin resistant as early as possible in your youth, which will start driving greater hunger because insulin and leptin will be disrupted centrally at the hypothalamus, promoting greater hunger. So satiety will go down. It will be focusing on more processed foods, which will be protein deficient. Everyone in this space, and a lot of people we've discussed would agree that is a lot of the problem as protein goes down. That will facilitate greater hunger or reduced satiety. And that will mean eating more and more processed foods. So the basic, every meal essentially is coming from bags and boxes with barcodes, which is a wonderful way to get a lot of refined carbohydrates to spike insulin and a lot of refined oils to fuel unhealthy fat cell growth. And in the process, these insulin resistant children will be sedentary, you know, living a life either because of school or because of difficult, you know, parents not engaging them ideally, or living in communities where it's not safe or practical to be engaging in a lot of outdoor activity. But they will be vitamin D deficient. They will be losing muscle mass when they should be growing it during their childhood and adolescent years, you know, making it difficult to control glucose for the reasons that we mentioned earlier. And then underlying all of this process of becoming overweight and sick at a very early age, you know, developing hypertension and diabetes in their teens, increasing the risk of heart disease, cancers, and dementia, increasing the economic and lifespan burden in a society. But underlying all of it is this disease of, you know, family and even morality, where we are losing the moral foundation that helped people have this sense of pride in being something unique and something special with, I would say, you know, a bit of divinity in every person that is worthy of capitalizing and growing. So there's this loss of, you know, sort of spiritual sense and even a common sense of morality across societies that used to anchor everyone together. So maybe to say that all another way, is this loss of connection. That might be a more sort of palatable way to explain it. That once upon a time we had these units within communities that really fostered connections with other individuals, certainly within the home and outside the home. And I think all of these variables come together. It's the increasing isolation, killing people emotionally and perhaps even a little intellectually, and then, of course, the destruction of the physical body by embracing a diet and a lifestyle with sleep deprivation in kids and the almost incessant consumption of processed foods that make children insulin resistant before they ever reach 10, you know, and then in their teens, they get type 2 diabetes, and then they're on multiple medications by the time they're 20, that once upon a time were medications for someone who was 80, you know. So we're getting fatter, sicker, and we're aging faster, all while we're getting more miserable by losing the social connections that were once so prevalent within communities.
Beautifully said for a situation that is unfortunately taking place. If people care about losing weight and they care about reducing the risk of chronic disease, talk to us about the number one most underrated blood test that they should be getting, which is fasting insulin.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways we could define metabolic health and even overall health. For me, it is a matter of insulin resistance. The problem with defining a lot of cardiometabolic outcomes is that we have a very glucose-centric paradigm. And this has led conventional clinical care to focus almost exclusively on glucose as the primary metabolic marker. And yet, underlying the changes in glucose that could be happening over time is the humble little hormone insulin, who's just overlooked, you know, just kind of crying out for some attention, sitting in the corner. But to sort of bring these ideas together, we look at glucose all the time, and any blood test, when someone goes into the clinic, they're going to measure glucose and they're going to measure hemoglobin A1C. And it could be normal and normal and normal for years, but the person has high blood pressure, they're gaining weight, they have migraine headaches. And so there's no even suspicion that the glucose could not only be contributing to these problems, but that there is any problem, metabolically speaking. But while the glucose levels have stayed at a normal range during all these years, decades even, the hormone insulin has been the canary in the coal mine. It has been increasing steadily year over year over year. And so to answer your question explicitly, if I were to say, is there a marker that has been overlooked? It is fasting insulin completely, full stop, because it is the earliest sign of metabolic disruption. That if we could shift from the glucose-centric paradigm away from the glucose and have an insulin-centric paradigm, by measuring insulin, we can not only detect the problems decades before they manifest. In other words, insulin would be elevated potentially 10 or 20 years before the glucose ever starts to change. So we detect it at its earliest stages. But by focusing on the insulin, we also embrace more effective strategies. Because with a glucose-centric paradigm, conventional clinical care will say, we need to lower the glucose at all costs, even at the expense of increasing insulin. And that is a way to make people fatter and sicker, which is why people with type 2 diabetes who are given insulin therapy to correct their glucose, because it's only seen as a glucose disease, do in fact get fatter and die faster. They're twice as likely to die from cancer, 3 times as likely to die from heart disease, twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease, because those chronic diseases are not problems of hyperglycemia per se, they're problems of hyperinsulinemia. So focus on the insulin, we can detect problems sooner, and we can treat them better, because it's the high insulin that's contributing, not the high glucose. The high glucose is a symptom.
Before we pull on some threads that are there, I always love when you come on the podcast and you give people tangible, practical things that they should be paying attention to. So when it comes to fasting insulin and the fact that it's one of the most underrated tests out there, and that often doctors don't order it unless if they suspect that something might be wrong with the patient. But you're saying basically that your fasting insulin could be out of whack years ahead of time before you are diagnosed with something. And it could look like excess weight. It could look like low energy. It could feel like being tired all the time. So what are the optimal numbers and what are the ranges when it comes to fasting insulin? And of course, this is not medical advice. Everybody's got to talk to their doctor, but I do think that there is medical literacy and people should be literate when it comes to fasting insulin and the ranges that they should be targeting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wish that there were firm consensus with regards to fasting insulin like we have with so many other markers. There isn't. And the ranges will vary almost from lab to lab. Someone could, if they convince their clinician to get their fasting insulin measured, it's entirely possible that the lab will say anything under 15 microunits per mil is normal. And I blanch at that idea. I think that's way too high. So with a little bit of scrutiny in the evidence, digging through the evidence, my conclusion is that if someone has a fasting insulin of 6 microunits per mil or less, that's a very, very good sign that the body is insulin sensitive. In other words, you only need a modest amount of insulin to get the job done. You know, whatever insulin needs to do. And insulin does a lot of things because, as a reminder to the audience, literally every single cell of the body is responsive to insulin. Or to say that another way, every cell has insulin receptors, these little docking sites for insulin to come and dock onto the cell and then tell the cell to do something. And there are all kinds of somethings that insulin will tell the cell to do depending on the cell. So measure the fasting insulin, hopefully less than 6 microunits per mil. That to me is a very, very good sign. If it's if it's around say 7 to 17 or so, that's a warning. And I know that's a bit of a big range, but it's just hard to know in that range whether you are consistently at say 15 or whether you are consistently at 5 and you just happen to have a peak in your insulin at that moment when you measured. And then anything above the high teens in insulin, I would say, is almost guaranteed to be a problem. But in that kind of middle range to the mid to low teens, it might be a problem. But again, it might be that you just caught the peak of insulin's natural circadian rhythm. And that's why, as much as I am a great advocate of measuring insulin, I also don't ever mean to imply that it's the only marker, that I think there are other scores, like, for example, the triglyceride to HDL ratio. Take triglycerides fasted, divide by HDL fasted, and that number, it varies a little bit across ethnicities, but the kind of average point appears to be around 1.5. So get your fasting insulin measured, absolutely, but also couple that with your triglyceride to HDL ratio. And if that number is less than 1.5, it's a very good sign that you're insulin sensitive. Even if your insulin creeped up into the teens, don't lose hope. Look at that number, and that'll help fill in some details. And the value of that number is, in the event that anyone listening is not able to convince their clinician to measure their insulin, because let's face it, it's not easy to do. It's often a bit of a battle to get it done. You will always get your triglyceride to HDL ratio measured, or not even the ratio, but those two numbers. Every blood test will include triglycerides. Every blood test will include HDL cholesterol. So take that ratio, just compute it on your own. And if it's less than 1.5, then you can be really confident that your fasting insulin is also going to be good.
Yeah, and I want to add a little caveat that fasting insulin is generally considered an inexpensive test, right? So there's the whole medical bureaucracy, for good reasons, you can say, where you have to get your doctor to order it. So there's the whole convincing side that's there. And if you generally ask nicely, I find that people are willing. Some doctors don't like to be told what to do, just like some people don't like to be told what to do. And in that case, remember, you are a client of theirs. You're a patient. So go shop around and find somebody else. And, in some instances, you might be able to use some direct to consumer services. We can list some of those below. There's a bunch of them that are out there. But let's continue. So we mentioned that, and I appreciated that caveat, that by no means is fasting insulin the only thing you're telling people they should be paying attention to. We're just saying why it's one of the most underrated markers to pay attention to, both for short-term health and long-term health. Now, on the short-term health side, there's this whole category. We've been doing this summer weight loss series that I've invited you to be a part of for your deep knowledge and expertise when it comes to the topic of insulin and energy expenditure inside the body. You made a video recently that was fantastic, and you said, really, when it comes to weight gain, we need two things to come in unison together to basically start that process of significantly starting to gain weight. Can you explain what those two things are and how they work together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can start with the one that appears to have the greater mass appeal, which would be calories, or what I would like to refer to as just energy, or sufficient energy. So you must have sufficient energy in the body, coming into the body, in order to provide the fuel for the growth of the fat cell. So that is pretty easy. That's very palatable because we have such a calorie-centric idea or view of obesity and weight gain, weight loss. However, what is too often overlooked is the absolute requirement of elevated insulin. A fat cell does not inherently know what to do with the energy that it has surrounding it. And let me just refer to my own lab. Here I am at my university. Right across the hallway in my building is my laboratory. And we are regularly growing fat cells on little petri dishes. And it is so stark to look at the difference in the way the fat cells behave in the absence or later the presence of insulin. So as we are growing the fat cells out across this little plate, they are surrounded with energy, calories. There's fat and there's glucose, which are the two building blocks for triglycerides within the fat cell itself. The triglycerides, which are kind of giving the fat cell its big fat blob, or what we call a lipid droplet. And so again, the fat cells are surrounded by calories, an abundance of energy, and yet they're small. There's no changes on those fat cells until we start sprinkling in insulin into the culture, into the bath, the medium, we call it, the liquid that the cells are bathing in. Once we start putting in insulin, now the fat cells know what to do, which is store the energy. So that's a part that's so often overlooked. And this doesn't apply to all metabolism in all cells, but it is a pretty central theme that cells need to be told what to do with the energy they have available. whether it's energy available on the outside to come in, or whether it's energy that the cell already has available within itself. It's the hormones. It's hormones like insulin or glucagon or epinephrine, adrenaline, and others, growth hormone, that signal to the cell what to do with the energy that it has access to. The cell doesn't just know what to do with the energy. The hormones are what's sort of sampling the entire body, understanding what's going on in the entire body, and then dictating individual cells. It's like the hormones are the conductor to the orchestra. Any individual section, the brass, the woodwinds, the percussion, they don't know what notes to play on their own. They need something to tell them when to come in, the pace, the volume. The hormones are the conductors of the orchestra. And when it comes to fat cell growth, you have on one side the hormone insulin, which is overwhelmingly promoting the growth of the fat cell. And it is so powerful in its own right that it is offset by multiple other hormones that tend to have a catabolic effect to insulin's anabolic effect, like some of the other ones I mentioned, glucagon and epinephrine, most obviously, and growth hormone. So there are a handful of hormones that are trying to get the fat cell to shrink and share its energy, all to try to offset the incredible power of insulin, which is telling the fat cell to store energy. But insulin goes even further than that. As much as insulin has a very pronounced central effect on, or directed effect on, fat cells to stimulate their growth, insulin also has effects at the brain, stimulating to some degree of appetite or satiety, in various instances. Not to mention the effect that insulin has on leptin levels from the fat cells. Again, a direct effect at the fat cell. But insulin will also elicit a whole body effect to slow metabolic rate. We have known that for decades. Indeed, over 100 years ago, two famous Harvard scientists, Elliot P. Joslin and Francis G. Benedict, Joslin kind of being the father of modern endocrinology, Benedict being the father of modern metabolism, they came together to try to understand the metabolism in what they called severe diabetes, which we would just say kind of uncontrolled type 1 diabetes. That they noted in these individuals who have no insulin, their metabolic rate was 20 to 30% higher than it should be. There was something uncontrolled, this fire just raging through their body. And you see this in people with type 1 diabetes. In fact, it's so obvious that some type 1 diabetics are tempted to capitalize on it and engage in a pattern of disordered eating, which is commonly called diabulimia. In other words, the type 1 diabetic learns that if they can eat whatever they want and enjoy it, eat it, swallow it, and keep it in their stomach and digest it, and they can be as skinny as they want to by simply deliberately underdosing their insulin. That is the most powerful evidence of the absolute requirement of insulin in telling fat cells to grow or to shrink, because they learn, again, just if they skip their injections, they will be as skinny as they want. Now, there is metabolic mayhem in the body in that instance. Their glucose levels are 10 times higher than they should be. Their ketones are 10 or 20 times higher than it should be. And they're dying, but they look as lean as they want to be. And that is because they have learned that injecting insulin is like injecting fat shots, as one type 1 diabetic referred to it. That they learn that it's the insulin that's making them gain weight, whether they, want to or not. So insulin tells the fat cells what to do with the energy that it has available, namely grow. But insulin also helps that growth by enriching the availability of total energy by reducing overall metabolic rate. And we even see this in people with type 2 diabetes. People with type 2 diabetes who go on insulin therapy, taking their already kind of high insulin and putting it even higher, their metabolic rate slows at the moment the therapy begins. And it's no surprise that diabetics around the world, type 1 or type 2, when they begin their insulin therapy, they gain weight. In a type 1 diabetic, it's often essential because they've been losing so much weight that the insulin hopefully will just get them back to where they should be. But in a type 2 diabetic who's often already overweight, once they start insulin therapy, it's guaranteed they're going to gain more weight. And so up they go. And so within this long-winded answer, Drew, I've touched on a lot of points. If I were to sort of bring it together, I would present what I hope is a unifying hypothesis, which is that there are two camps, and I don't want to straw man any one of them and speak for either of them, but you would have the kind of pure caloric theorists who would say, no, it's purely a matter of calories in, calories out, hormones be damned. Or you have the other camp, which is, they would say it's purely a matter of insulin and it's pure hormones. I might have misspoke earlier, but then in that case, calories don't matter. Whereas the other group would say hormones don't matter. But in reality, both do. You must, to put it in a succinct sort of thesis statement, you must have elevated insulin to signal the growth of fat cell, and you must have sufficient energy to fuel the growth of the fat cell. Either is insufficient. You need both. I simply harp more on the insulin because it's the one that's so much more readily overlooked. That we have the caloric centric view of obesity has so enamored the world that there's almost no room intellectually to consider that there's another facet to this, namely hormones.
No, that's a great breakdown. Thank you for that. So a few clarifying questions, right? So you're saying we need both of them. We need excess calories, more than what we're burning in a day, and we also need elevated insulin.
Right. So Drew, I don't like to use the word excess calories. I like to just say sufficient, because excess, I worry that the term excess implies a need to kind of be accounting for calories. And as much as I agree that calories do matter, I'm very readily admitting that. I think that if we attempt to quantify them and count them, we're doomed. And I can sort of revisit that idea later. Part of my beef with the caloric view of obesity is this, what I consider absolute fallacy, that we can account for calories, where we cannot. The human body, to invoke terms of physics, after all, and I can do that because even invoking calories and energy is invoking terms of physics. The human body is an open system. We are not a closed system. We cannot account for every movement of energy, whether we would call it a calorie or not, into and out of the body. For example, if insulin is low, caloric rate goes up. And I mentioned earlier the studies of Joslin and Benedict quantifying metabolic rate in untreated type 1 diabetes. The metabolic rate was 20 or 30% too high. That's literally because the energy, the metabolic machinery is burning hotter. The engine is idling at a higher rate, but also in the same instance where insulin is low and now the body is burning so much fat that it can't stop burning fat, because in the absence of insulin, fat burning goes unchecked, that the body is burning more fat than it needs to meet its energetic needs, and thus the excess starts to become ketones. So ketones are simply a product of, if you will, excess fat burning. And now when we start making ketones, every ketone has a caloric value roughly comparable to glucose. Most people don't appreciate that. Ketones have a caloric potential or an energy potential to them, what we could call calories. Again, roughly similar to glucose. And if insulin is low enough that we're burning a lot of fat, then we start burning more fat and turning it into ketones. Now when we're making ketones, we are dumping the ketones out of our bodies into the atmosphere. Whether we're breathing the ketones out or whether we are urinating them out, every ketone has a caloric value that, based on the caloric kind of view of obesity, we need to account for as we're counting calories, trying to get into a caloric deficit or whatever the outcome may be that we want. We cannot quantify the potentially hundreds of calories in a 24-hour period that are just being dumped back into the atmosphere in the form of our breath or our urine. And so that's another reason I grimace a little bit when people too staunchly advocate for a caloric view. But anyway, to bring it all back to my concern, I don't like to use the word excess calories because it does imply a certain degree of counting, which I disagree with. As much as I think calories matter, I think, and we can get into kind of my advice on specifics and strategies for weight loss later, and I will bring this back up. But calories will sort of take care of itself if the hormones are in order.
Thank you for that clarification. I'd love to just talk about my own personal journey and kind of get your thoughts on it, right? And from a standpoint that might resonate with the audience. I get a lot of people that write into me, people that leave comments on YouTube, people on my newsletter who are in a similar boat as me. So last August, so almost about a year ago, I came back from a trip in Italy. I know you've been traveling with your family this summer. You were in Europe. So you know how it goes, right? Enjoying all the different foods, getting a chance to explore, eating some things that I maybe traditionally wouldn't, eat as much as I'm in America. And I came back and I said, in particular for me, and now we're blending a lot of different topics, but these are all topics that you talk about. So I think you have a unique standpoint. So I had just conducted an interview with somebody that I believe you're familiar with, Dr. Gabrielle Line. And on her coming on the podcast, I really got the sense, and you've shared this a lot when it comes to insulin, is that if I'm going to improve my insulin sensitivity even further and also improve my overall metabolic health, which already was testing really great. I think at the time my fasting insulin was right around like 4.3, somewhere around there. It's been as low as like 3. And I want to reduce my risk of sarcopenia and all these other things that I really needed to focus on building skeletal muscle, right? So I found a great gym over here in Los Angeles that it's called UP, and they would measure me regularly just to get a baseline through caliber testing. I also got an in-body scan, and I came in and I measured in at, of course, it was after a month in Italy, but still it was a combination of being under muscled and sort of having a little bit extra, body fat. So I measured in at body composition at around 26% body fat, right? And I really set on a journey of, okay, I'm going to get serious about strength training because of all the benefits, including many of the benefits that you've talked about, not just people wanting to have vanity metrics and not just longevity, but metabolic health today, right? And we'll break that down a little bit further. And so through this process of initially increasing muscle mass and sort of temporarily for the program that I was on, cutting, body fat percentage, one of the things that I had experienced is that at different phases, even with my fasting insulin, which I get measured pretty much every quarter, so I have pretty good data on it on a regular basis and I can see the trends that are there, is that even with a pretty good fasting insulin of like 4, 5, 5.3 maybe was the highest that I've been, even for me, I was able to put on a little bit of extra belly fat and you could kind of pinch it. Now, by no means at all, just to be super clear with people, I'm not obese. I'm lean. I've never been obese. I wouldn't even pretend to understand what it means to be overweight and all the different things that go with that. But specifically from the standpoint of packing on a little bit of belly fat, which a lot of people experience, I was able to do that even with a sort of optimal insulin range. What do you think was going on for me? Was it just simply that my metabolic health was not optimized because I didn't have enough muscle mass? Any thoughts that you have?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's very important that we don't conflate the ideas of insulin resistance and weight gain. That the fact that a body is gaining weight actually suggests that the fat cells are insulin sensitive. Now there are so many thoughts that I want to express here that I'm going to try to make it a very cohesive line of thinking here. You really can't appreciate whole body insulin resistance without appreciating the origins of it, which I believe are very firmly at the fat cell. There are, every tissue is responsive to insulin, and as it becomes insulin resistant or not would contribute to whole body insulin resistance. But in your case, we have a guy whose fasting insulin levels are good. My counter would be, what were your insulin levels throughout the day when you aren't fasted? That's where I think we have to appreciate this. Where Drew was on vacation and where Ben was on vacation, because I experienced very much the same thing coming back from this wonderful European trip with my family, definitely chubbier than when I left. And I don't have a full head of hair like you do, Drew, to kind of mask it. If you got a bald, chubby guy at the beach, you just see a bald, chubby guy. I don't have a beautiful head of hair to, act as at least it can say, give me some kind of compliment. It's just a pasty, freckled, bald, chubby dude. So I was very mindful of that. And have been just like you. So now, whereas you and I are still generally insulin sensitive, and we have a fasted insulin that falls in a normal range, and indeed a range that I would consider good. What was happening from sun up to sundown when we weren't fasted? And that's where so many people have the problem, where we have such a culture of carbohydrate heavy foods and eating so frequently that the average individual, certainly when Drew and Ben are on vacation, spends almost every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. And we're still insulin sensitive enough that after a 12-hour fast, our insulin comes down. But what happens in those other 12 hours during the day, or more than 12 hours, depending on what we eat before we go to bed, when our insulin is elevated? We have such a culture globally of focusing on carbohydrates as the primary source of calories, and often very refined carbohydrates, and eating every 2 or so hours. So we never actually give insulin a chance to come down, right? When insulin's starting to come down, we spike it right back up. That is how we can gain weight and yet still have a nice fasted insulin number, again, when we are fasted. But the net effect, there was a paper published in Humans that had people overeat carbohydrates for 7 days. So it was a high carbohydrate diet for 7 days. And at the end of the 7 days, the fasted insulin was 2.5 times higher. So I would say the bill comes due that maybe that you or I, in your case, because you were measuring your fasted insulin so readily, it wasn't enough to actually start promoting a more lingering insulin resistance, but we know it happens. This just in as short as 1 week, the fasted insulin went from around 5 microunits per mil up to high teens in these people, again, in a fasted state. And that just means in that case, even when you are fasted, you have gone into the realm of what scientists at University of Pittsburgh identified years ago called metabolic inflexibility, which is basically just you're insulin resistant and your body now is having a hard time shifting to fat burning, even when you're fasted, even when you should have gone to fat burning. The body's a hybrid, burning glucose or fats primarily. And insulin is the switch that determines which fuel the body's using. And so that is, again, when fat gain will start to amplify, where you're not only gaining fat during the day, but you're potentially not turning to fat burning during the night, when you should be, which would be helping with some degree of fat loss. You're still potentially storing fat even when the body wants to be burning it. But let me just revisit the role of the fat cell very briefly. And this is a particular interest with two guys like me and you. You have Ben Bikman, who is kind of European, Northern European descent, and I have Drew. Drew, I think you're South Asian.
Indian, yep.
Yep. So these are two remarkably comparable ethnicities. When I did my postdoctoral work in Singapore, one of the reasons Singapore was so interested in partnering with Duke University, which is where I was to understand these ethnic differences on how you can take ethnicities, particularly in Singapore, with both Chinese, South Asian, Malaysian, and European. And you have these 4 different guys who are best drinking buddies, and they're all gaining weight, and yet they start to suffer the consequences of that weight gain at very different rates. But a study done in Caucasians compared to South Asians, not only do we know that the average South Asian Indian has a fasted insulin that is more than double what his Caucasian counterpart is, but also, even at the same body weight, his fat cells are about 3 to 4 times larger than his Caucasian counterpart. And there are these, and this could explain why partly India has more people with type 2 diabetes, absolute numbers more than anyone, but of course India's population is so massive. Even per capita, it's approaching the #1 spot in the world, being truly the diabetes capital of the world. And a part of it is this combination, yes, environment, diet matters, but also genetics. And so that is, it's very much important for us to understand what we could call the personal fat threshold, that based on our genetics and partly our diet, certain bodies have the potential to store fat in their fat cells to varying levels. And just Caucasians, in the case of this example, appear to have the higher threshold. But basically, as long as you can continue to store fat in fat cells, the body stays metabolically sound. And that it's once the fat cells start to reach a point of maximum dimension, and by that I mean every individual fat cell is getting too big, now the body has reached its threshold. And if insulin is attempting to still tell the body to store energy, now you have a war, a metabolic mutiny, where the fat cell starts to rebel. So we gain fat through two different processes. You have two buddies, two college, you have Drew and Ben. We're going on vacation, hanging out together, and we both come back from our trip 10 pounds fatter. Because of our unique ethnicity and the genetics that come with that, some of my weight gain potentially would have happened through some modest degree of hyperplasia, where when my fat cells started to get a little big, I would simply create some new fat cells. Whereas Drew, with South Asian ethnicity, your fat cells, you have a very limited potential for hyperplasia. In other words, you're not going to multiply your fat cells. The number of fat cells is pretty set. So then what happens is the fat cells each just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So each fat cell is carrying a bigger metabolic load than it would normally. Whereas again, in another body that can undergo hyperplasia, the fat cell gets a little big and it recruits a new fat cell, which gets a little big. So more important than the mass of fat we have on our body is the size of each individual fat cell, which of course is impossible to measure outside of a lab. We can do that thing here in my lab by taking biopsies of people's fat tissue. But even still, it's not something you're going to really do. That's why you start to look at these other markers that we mentioned. But to sort of wrap through this idea quickly, when the fat cell gets really, really big, two problems start to happen. One, it starts to reach a point of maximum dimension that it can't grow anymore. Otherwise, the cell membrane starts to lose its integrity and literally start to pop, which would be a very messy, inflammatory process. And at the second, the fat cell, as it's swollen up to 10 or 20 times bigger than it used to be, is now suffocating. It's getting pushed too far from capillaries. In other words, blood vessels where it can get oxygen and give it CO2 and get nutrients. So the fat cell starts to get too big and it starts to suffocate. This elicits two responses. When the fat cell starts to get so big, it starts to tell insulin, you are trying to make me big and yet I can't grow anymore. And so while you are trying to block me from breaking down my fat, I'm not listening and I'm going to start leaking fats. To say that in a more precise term, insulin normally inhibits lipolysis, which is the term for breaking down fat. That's the primary mechanism whereby insulin promotes the growth of a fat cell, not necessarily force feeding it, but preventing it from breaking it down. So the fat cell says, insulin, fats are still coming in or glucose is still coming in, but now I'm going to start breaking down fat even though you're trying to tell me not to. So one, the fat cell, the hypertrophic or swollen fat cell becomes insulin resistant to prevent further growth, leaking free fatty acids into the blood in the midst of elevated insulin. And those two things should not be high at the same time. High insulin and high free fatty acids now means you're going to start storing fat in other places throughout the body, most especially the liver, getting fatty liver and excess fat in the pancreas, creating insulin resistance in those tissues. But the second problem, as I mentioned, is that the fat cell becomes hypoxic. It starts to suffocate, if you will, as it's gotten pushed too far from the capillary. The fat cell has a potential solution for that too, and that is by secreting a bunch of pro-inflammatory cytokines into the bloodstream. So the hypertrophic fat cell becomes very pro-inflammatory because some of those cytokines that it's secreting have the ability to promote the growth of new capillaries. And so it starts to correct its hypoxia by stimulating the growth of new fat cells, which is a better outcome than suffocating and becoming necrotic. Once again, a very messy, inflamed death if that were to happen. So the hypertrophic fat cell, in order to ensure its own survival, becomes insulin resistant to prevent further growth, inadvertently thereby flooding the body with free fatty acids to be stored elsewhere. And two, becomes very pro-inflammatory in order to correct its own hypoxia, but in the process, flooding the body with pro-inflammatory cytokines, things like C-reactive protein, for example, which is increasingly measured on blood tests. But the combination of these two things, high free fatty acids and high inflammation, is a wicked combination because now you start promoting the accumulation of these other types of fats in the body called ceramides within the cells. And when these two signals come to a cell, promote ceramide development or accumulation, now those cells become insulin resistant as well. Whether it's the brain, whether it's the muscle, whether it's the liver, or the blood vessels, promoting hypertension. This is why I have a fat first focus, that fat cells are the first domino to fall. That when the fat cells become insulin resistant, that's that earliest stages where the insulin's going up, but it's all still enough to keep glucose in check. You know, the muscles are still responding to the insulin, pulling in glucose. The liver is still responding to the insulin, pulling in and storing glucose, helping blood glucose levels stay low. But once the fat cells have become insulin resistant and now pro-inflammatory, they start spreading that insulin resistance to, like, for example, muscle and liver. Now you have the glucose levels start to climb. So where you have other people who may promote or advocate an idea that the muscle becomes insulin resistant first or the liver, I don't agree with that, because if that were the case, then glucose levels would start to climb immediately. They don't. Glucose levels stay low because insulin resistance starts in the very low metabolic rate fat cells, and then it spreads to the higher metabolic rate, higher glucose consuming tissues, you know, like the muscle, for example. But anyway, Drew, to sort of put a fine little bow on this, to wrap it up nicely in response to your question, which was a long time ago, and it was this comment about your fasted insulin, how could you gain weight? To say that maybe in one final sense, the longer a body stays insulin sensitive, the more weight it can continue to gain. And this is why you see these instances of these TV shows where it's people who weigh 600 pounds. And yet, if you were to measure their blood and measure their metabolic markers, they would look probably pretty okay. Now, they're clearly not okay. There are consequences to having that degree of super massive obesity. But if we were to look at, say, their triglyceride HDL ratio or their fasted insulin, it would probably be normal, because it's not the
You're saying that when
amount
they're
of fat.
at their heaviest, like we're talking about, like, let's say, like The Biggest Loser or something, just to make sure, because I wasn't following. You're saying if we looked at their labs when they are at their heaviest or when they lost the weight?
No, even when they're heavy. Now, although it would depend on how close they'd come to their threshold. And maybe, let me say this another way, I guess. People who have the genetic propensity to continue to go through fat cell hyperplasia have an almost limitless amount of fat gain. I mean, maybe there would be a point at which the body simply would stop. But the fact that they can continue to gain more and more fat means that the fat tissue is responding to the insulin. And that means they keep multiplying their fat cells. What starts to happen in people who don't have hyperplasia, who have a set number of fat cells, which is actually how most people are across all ethnicities, despite kind of what I alluded to, Caucasian or not. Most people have a very finite number of fat cells. And this is why most people can't gain a limitless amount of weight. You know, Drew, you and I, if we were both to challenge ourselves to gain 500 pounds, it would probably be impossible. You know, maybe we could gain about 100 pounds. And then even if we kept eating and abusing our bodies that way, we simply would stop. We had reached our threshold of the total amount of fat our bodies could store. But now we start to really have the metabolic consequences of it, because the fat cells have reached their maximum point. Now all the metabolic mayhem ensues. We become hypertensive. We become very diabetic. But it's when the fat cells become insulin resistant that the body can't gain any more fat. That's why most people reach a limit. They've reached their threshold. And as the high insulin and the sufficient calories continue to try to tell the body to store more energy, now it can't be stored in the fat cells. And now you have what is sometimes referred to as ectopic fat deposition, where you're now storing fat in tissues that are poorly designed for the fat storage or for the long-term fat storage, like fatty liver disease, fatty pancreas, even too much fat in muscles, which facilitates insulin resistance in the muscle tissue.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
Your body produces it because it's the first, earliest expression of things gone wrong. We saw it in children.